Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This channel is here for slow science and quiet storytelling. No hype, no wild speculation, just humble archaeology and careful history, told softly. If you value this kind of long-form content, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way to knowledge. And if you'd like, share in the comments how you use these stories. Do you listen at night before bed, or during the day as you work? However you join me, know that if you drift off mid-chapter, I've placed timestamps in the description so you can pick up right where you left off, because the story is worth hearing all the way through. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. How can a simple hill of dirt contain thousands of years of civilization? At first sight, there is almost nothing to suggest it. A low rise on the northwestern edge of Turkey, baking in the sun, surrounded by farmland and quiet villages. Travellers could easily pass it by without a second glance. Yet for centuries this mound, known locally as Hisarlik, has been a puzzle. Beneath its surface lie buried traces of a settlement that endured for over 3 millennia, long before modern nations, long before written histories in this part of the world. From a distance it looks ordinary. Up close, it has been called one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth. Hisarlik lies a few miles from the narrow Strait of the Dardanelles, a waterway that has always mattered. Today the strait divides Europe from Asia, a funnel through which ships pass to reach the Black Sea. The Gallipoli Peninsula lies to the west, remembered for the terrible campaign of the First World War in which hundreds of thousands died. Yet long before that modern tragedy, this landscape was already saturated with memory. Whoever controlled this crossing point held the key to movement between continents. Whoever lived on this mound overlooked one of the busiest sea lanes of the ancient world. Geography is the first explanation for why Hisarlik mattered, and why layer after layer of settlement accumulated here over thousands of years. The mound itself is what archaeologists call a tell. These mounds form over generations as one settlement is built on the ruins of the last. Houses collapse, fires sweep through, new foundations are laid on top of the old. Over centuries the ground rises, a man-made hill concealing its own history. Hisarlik became such a tell, built up by human occupation, starting around the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era. By the time modern travellers began to wonder about it, the mound stood as a silent archive, sealed and forgotten. To stand there today is to feel the strangeness of time collapsed into one place. Wind rattles through dry grass, farmers plough the surrounding fields, the modern visitor centre offers explanations and reconstructions. But for much of recorded history the mound was simply part of the landscape, its deeper significance unknown. Only the locals saw hints in the broken pottery and scattered stones, and only in the past 2 centuries did outsiders begin to suspect that beneath this hill might lie the ruins of a legendary city. The idea that Hisarlik hid something ancient did not appear out of nowhere. In the 17th century, European travellers had already begun to speculate about its possible antiquity. Diplomats, soldiers, and adventurers passed through this corner of the Ottoman Empire and sometimes remarked on the mound. Some noted fragments of masonry protruding from the soil. Others heard rumours that ruins lay underneath. For them it was curiosity, not science. But in hindsight, those early hints showed that the hill was more than just a hill. By the 18th century, antiquarian interest grew stronger. This was a period when Europeans, especially the British and French, became fascinated with the ruins of the classical world. Ancient sites were not studied with modern rigour, but there was a hunger to connect landscapes with stories told by Greek and Roman authors. Maps were drawn with possible locations of lost cities. Armchair scholars argued over which valley or plain matched descriptions in ancient texts. Hisarlik was just one candidate among many. The 19th century brought a decisive shift. The Ottoman Empire allowed increasing numbers of foreign visitors and excavators into its lands. Archaeology itself was transforming from treasure hunting into a recognisable discipline, albeit slowly and unevenly. Hisarlik caught the attention of one man in particular, Frank Calvert, a British expatriate who owned farmland in the area. Calvert noticed the mound rising from the plain near his property. He suspected it might conceal an ancient settlement, and even suggested it could be the site of the famous city sought by generations of readers of antiquity. Calvert lacked the funds to dig on a large scale, but his observations would later guide others. Before those excavations began, however, it is worth pausing to imagine the mound as it appeared in the early 19th century. It was not marked by signs or tourist paths. Sheep grazed nearby. Farmers worked the surrounding land much as they do today. A few scattered stones hinted at something old, but nothing like the monumental ruins visible at sites such as Ephesus or Pergamon. Hisarlik looked modest, almost disappointing. Its secrets lay hidden beneath meters of soil. The idea that beneath it were layers upon layers of cities, each built upon the last, was difficult to imagine without digging. By this time, European scholars were engaged in fierce debates over deep history. Some still held to biblical chronologies that placed the Earth at only a few thousand years old. Others were beginning to consider that human civilization might be far older. Ancient mounds like Hisarlik offered a way to test these ideas, though the methods were crude. Archaeology in the mid-19th century lacked careful stratigraphy, carbon dating, or any of the scientific tools available today. Excavators relied mostly on spades, instincts, and sometimes dynamite. The results could be dramatic, but they often destroyed as much as they revealed. The importance of Hisarlik before large-scale excavation lay in its setting. Standing on the mound, one looks out over the plain of the Scamander River. To the west lies the Aegean Sea, to the east the passage into Asia. Hills rise in the distance. It is a landscape of openness and exposure. For ancient peoples, this was both opportunity and danger. Traders could arrive by sea. Armies could march across the plain. Control of this vantage point meant influence over who came and went. That is why generations of people chose to build their homes here, despite fires, earthquakes, and invasions. The mound's very existence is testimony to human persistence in a contested landscape. The puzzle remained: why was this mound not more widely recognised in earlier centuries? Part of the reason is that the ruins were buried. Unlike monumental Greek temples or Roman amphitheatres, little stood above ground. Another part of the reason is that travellers often looked elsewhere. Competing theories placed the site of ancient cities in nearby valleys or along different rivers. The landscape is rich in ruins, and without excavation, guesses were easy to make and difficult to prove. Hisarlik blended into this patchwork of speculation. When European powers expanded their influence in the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century, the search for antiquities became a matter of prestige. Museums in London, Berlin, and Paris competed to display treasures. Collectors scoured the eastern Mediterranean. In this climate, Hisarlik began to attract more serious attention. Frank Calvert was among the first to suggest digging, but he lacked resources. The mound waited for someone with the ambition, wealth, and recklessness to attempt it. And so the hill remained quiet through centuries of change. Farmers came and went, empires rose and fell, pilgrims, soldiers, and tourists passed nearby without suspecting what lay beneath their feet. Only scattered hints. Pottery shards, stone foundations gave clues. For the most part, the mound slumbered, its secrets sealed by earth. It would not be until the later 19th century that its silence would be broken in earnest. What does this tell us? That the most ordinary places can hide extraordinary stories. That a hill of dirt may in fact be a library of civilizations. Hisarlik is not unique in that sense. Across Anatolia and the Middle East are thousands of similar mounds, each preserving its own history. But few have captured imagination in the same way. The reason, of course, is that people began to suspect this one might be linked with one of the most famous tales ever told. But that is a story for later. For now, it is enough to know that by the time the spades and pickaxes arrived in the late 19th century, Hisarlik had already been standing for more than 3,000 years, layer upon layer of human life waiting to be revealed. And the haunting question is this: how many other hills around the world conceal civilizations we no longer remember? How many ordinary landscapes hold memories that will never be uncovered, because no one has thought to look, or because time has erased them beyond recovery? Did Heinrich Schliemann find Troy, or did he destroy it? That is the uncomfortable question that hangs over the story of 19th century archaeology. His name is remembered in every history of the field, celebrated for his bold claim that he uncovered the legendary city. Yet almost in the same breath he is condemned for the methods he used, methods so brutal that they would horrify archaeologists today. To judge him fairly, we need to step back into his life, into the world of the 19th century, and into the strange mix of obsession, imagination, and opportunity that made his excavation possible. Schliemann's beginnings were far from glamorous. He was born in northern Germany in the year 1822 into a modest household where books were a luxury. According to stories he later told about himself, he first encountered the ancient world as a boy when he was given a copy of Homer. Whether this tale was true or part of the myth he later constructed around his own life is uncertain. What we know is that as a young man he did not set out on an academic path. He became a clerk, then a trader, and eventually a wealthy businessman through ventures in Russia and the United States. He was, before anything else, a man of commerce, restless, ambitious, and willing to risk everything for profit. Fate intervened in dramatic ways. He survived shipwrecks, illnesses, and political upheavals. He made and lost fortunes. By his 40s he had grown disillusioned with business, endured a failed marriage, and was seeking a new identity. He enrolled at the Sorbonne in Paris for lectures on philology and history, but he never pursued formal academic training. He was, in essence, an autodidact, someone who taught himself languages, archaeology and history with remarkable energy. Accounts suggest that he mastered a dozen languages through sheer force of will, reading and memorizing as if driven by an inner fire. It was in this period of reinvention that he returned to the boyhood dream he claimed to have cherished all along, to rediscover the lost city of Troy. To understand why this mattered, we need to remember the intellectual climate of the mid-19th century. The line between myth and history was blurred. The idea that Homer's stories might contain kernels of real events was not absurd, but neither was it widely accepted. Some scholars dismissed Troy as legend. Others believed that the Iliad could be anchored in geography if only someone would look closely enough. Schliemann, with his wealth, determination and flair for drama, was the right kind of outsider to attempt it, yet he was not the first to suspect that the mound at Hisarlik held the answer. That honour belongs to Frank Calvert, a British expatriate living in the Dardanelles. Calvert was a consular official and landowner with a strong amateur interest in antiquities. He spent years studying the landscape and became convinced that Hisarlik was the best candidate for the site of ancient Troy. He even began small-scale digs on his own property nearby, though his limited means prevented him from pursuing a full excavation. When he met Schliemann in the 1860s, he shared his theory. Schliemann, with his restless drive and deep pockets, seized the opportunity. The collaboration between the two men quickly turned lopsided. Schliemann had the money, the charisma, and the hunger for recognition. Calvert had the careful local knowledge, but when history was later written, it was Schliemann's name that dominated the headlines. Calvert faded into the margins, his role minimised or forgotten. Only in recent decades has his contribution been more fully acknowledged. Without him, Schliemann might never have turned to Hisarlik at all. In the early 1870s, Schliemann began to dig. His enthusiasm was immense, but his methods were crude. Rather than carefully peeling away layers of soil, he sought to reach what he imagined was the level of the Homeric city as quickly as possible. He employed dozens of local workers and ordered them to carve a great trench straight through the mound from north to south. It was an operation of brute force. Crowbars, pickaxes, and even winches were used to haul out enormous blocks of stone and earth. Entire sections of the ancient settlement were ripped away. This approach reflected his background. He was not trained to think in terms of stratigraphy, the careful recording of sequential layers that would become standard practice in archaeology. Instead, he thought in terms of treasure and discovery. The deeper he went, the closer he believed he was to the truth. In the process, he destroyed much of the evidence that would have helped later archaeologists reconstruct the story with more precision. The so-called Schliemann Trench remains visible today as a scar across the site, a reminder of the damage done. Yet even in his destructiveness, Schliemann revealed something astonishing. The trench showed that Hisarlik was not a single settlement, but a tell containing multiple layers of occupation. Beneath the surface were stacked centuries upon centuries of human history. He may not have recognized the full implications, but the discovery was monumental. The mound contained not one city, but many, each built upon the ruins of its predecessor. For Schliemann, this was vindication enough. He proclaimed that he had found Troy. The world listened. Newspapers published his reports, often embellished with dramatic flourishes. His stories captured the imagination of a public eager for links to the ancient world. Scholars, however, were less convinced. They criticised his methods, his selective reporting, and his tendency to shape evidence to fit his narrative. The controversy was immediate, and it has never entirely faded. Was he a pioneer or a vandal? Perhaps both. He brought global attention to the site, inspired generations of archaeologists, and proved that Hisarlik held deep antiquity. At the same time, he obliterated irreplaceable layers of evidence. His hunger for recognition led him to exaggerate, to publish premature conclusions, and to claim credit that belonged partly to others. Hisarlik survived his assault, but with scars. It is tempting to judge him by modern standards, yet he was a man of his century. Archaeology in the 1870s was still a rough craft, closer to treasure hunting than to the meticulous science it would later become. Few excavators anywhere in the world were practicing careful stratigraphy. The idea of preserving sites for future study was not widely embraced. In that context, Schliemann was not uniquely destructive, though he was unusually ambitious and spectacular. His life itself was shaped by spectacle. He remarried, choosing a much younger Greek woman named Sophia, whom he famously dressed in ancient ornaments for photographs that he circulated to the press. He cultivated the image of the romantic discoverer, the man who had unearthed the city sung by Homer. He told stories of his adventures with a flair that blurred fact and invention. To his admirers he was a hero of discovery. To his critics he was reckless, vain, and careless with truth. Both portraits contain elements of reality. The story of Hisarlik in the 1870s cannot be told without him, but it also cannot be told without Calvert. The British landowner provided the intellectual foundation, the quiet observations, and the crucial insight that the mound deserved attention. Without his patient conviction, Schliemann might never have looked to that hill. Without Schliemann's energy and wealth, Calvert's theory might have remained a footnote. Together they represent the paradox of early archaeology: local knowledge overshadowed by flamboyant outsiders, caution eclipsed by ambition. Today, archaeologists revisit Schliemann's work with mixed feelings. They acknowledge his role in bringing Troy into the modern imagination. They lament the destruction his trench caused. They continue to sift through his diaries and reports, trying to separate what he really found from what he wanted people to believe he had found. It is a reminder that archaeology is never just about soil and stone. It is also about the personalities of those who dig, and the stories they choose to tell about their discoveries. Did Heinrich Schliemann find Troy, or did he destroy it? The truth lies somewhere in between. He tore open the mound in search of a city that may or may not have matched the poems he loved. He obliterated evidence that would have helped us answer that question with more clarity. Yet he also forced the world to recognise that Hisarlik was no ordinary hill. In that sense he both revealed and obscured. He brought Troy into the light and left parts of it in permanent shadow. And the haunting question is this: when we look back at figures like Schliemann, do we celebrate them for their daring, or condemn them for their mistakes? Or do we simply accept that knowledge often arrives through imperfect hands, shaped by the flaws and obsessions of the people who seek it? What if Troy was not a single city at all, but 9? That is the startling realization that emerged as archaeologists slowly came to grips with the mound of Hisarlik. When first approached in the 19th century, many imagined that beneath the soil lay the ruins of one particular city, fixed in time, waiting to be uncovered like a buried treasure chest. Instead, the spades revealed something altogether more complicated, a place where civilizations had piled one on top of another for over 3,000 years. The mound turned out to be not a monument frozen in a single era, but a vertical archive of human persistence. Each layer, each foundation, each fragment of wall belonged to a different community, with its own story, its own struggles, and its own eventual collapse. The technical term for this kind of site is stratigraphy, the study of layers. In a tell like Hisarlik, the layers accumulate as generations build, destroy, rebuild, and abandon. Sometimes the change comes gradually, with houses slowly being replaced over centuries. Sometimes it comes suddenly, with fires or earthquakes reducing everything to rubble in a single season. Either way, the remains are left behind, compacted and eventually built over. When archaeologists cut into such a mound, they see the sequence like a cross-section of a cake, each slice revealing centuries of history compressed into soil and stone. Hisarlik is one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon, with 9 major occupational phases stretching from the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era to the late Roman period around the 7th century of our era. The first of these, now called Troy I, began around the year 3000 before the Common Era. This was the dawn of the early Bronze Age in Anatolia, when small communities clustered on hilltops for protection and access to fertile plains. Troy was not a grand city, but a modest settlement of perhaps a few dozen families. They lived in simple houses, cultivated the surrounding land, and took advantage of their position overlooking the Dardanelles. The architecture was basic, the pottery handmade, but even at this early stage there were hints of ambition. The settlement was encircled by a defensive wall, suggesting that even the first Trojans understood the importance of securing this strategic location. Above this earlier settlement rose Troy II, dated to roughly 2500 before the Common Era. Here archaeologists found evidence of a more complex community. Large megaron-style buildings were constructed, long rectangular halls with central hearths that suggest communal or elite functions. Pottery styles became more refined, trade goods more diverse. There were indications that Troy too was connected to wider networks, importing materials such as obsidian and possibly exchanging goods with the Aegean islands. It was this layer that Heinrich Schliemann mistakenly believed to be Homer's Troy, dazzled by its scale compared to the earlier village. In reality, it was far older than any Greek epic, belonging to a time when the Aegean world had not yet given rise to palatial cultures. Troy 3, 4 and 5 followed in succession between roughly 2200 and 1800 before the Common Era. These layers are less monumental but show continuity. The settlement contracted at times, then expanded again. Walls were rebuilt, houses modified. Pottery shows influences from both Anatolia and the Aegean, reflecting a community that straddled cultural zones. It is possible that populations shifted in and out depending on regional upheavals, with some phases showing decline and others renewed vigour. Together, these Middle Bronze Age Troys remind us that cities are rarely linear in their development. They pulse with cycles of growth, stagnation, and adaptation. By the time of Troy VI, dated from around 1700 to 1300 before the Common Era, the settlement reached a new level of grandeur. Massive stone fortifications were built, with sloping walls and towers that still impress visitors today. Multi-storey houses suggest a wealthier urban population. This was a city that looked outward across the seas, engaged in trade and diplomacy. For many modern archaeologists, Troy VI fits the image of a thriving late Bronze Age centre, contemporary with the palatial cultures of Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire to the east. Its imposing walls mark one of the high points of settlement on the mound. Troy VII followed, beginning around the 13th century before the Common Era. It reused many of the fortifications of Troy VI but shows signs of crowding. Houses were built tightly against the walls, storage jars were sunk into the floors, and space seems to have been at a premium. These details suggest a population under stress, perhaps from external threats. While debates continue about the causes, what is clear is that Troy VII represents a society facing challenges and seeking resilience. Troy VIII belongs to the early first millennium before the Common Era, when Greek settlers returned to the mound centuries after the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. They re-established a city here, building temples and public spaces in the style of classical Greece. The memory of the earlier city may already have been part of their motivation, for by this time stories of a great war at Troy were circulating in oral traditions. The site thus became both a place to live and a place of remembrance. Troy IX is the Roman city, known as Ilium, flourishing from the 1st century before the Common Era through to the late Empire. This was a grand settlement with a forum, theatre and monumental buildings sponsored by emperors who claimed Trojan ancestry. It served as both a living city and a shrine to the mythical past. Visitors from across the Mediterranean came to see the place where they believed heroes had once fought. This final flourishing extended the life of the mound into late antiquity, before gradual decline left it abandoned by the 7th century of our era. What makes Hisarlik remarkable is not just the individual phases but the continuity they represent. For over 3,000 years, people repeatedly chose this hilltop as their home. They rebuilt after disasters, reoccupied after periods of abandonment, and layered their lives atop those of their predecessors. The result is a vertical history unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world. 9 major Troys, countless minor variations, each contributing to the rise of the mound. When archaeologists stand in the Great Trench today, they can point to these layers stacked one on another. Each stratum contains pottery, walls, hearths, and sometimes human remains. Each tells a fragment of the story, but piecing them together is challenging. Soil collapses, stonework erodes, earlier mistakes in excavation blur the boundaries. Our knowledge of the sequence is still being refined. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, and comparisons with other sites help anchor the chronology, but uncertainties remain. That humility is part of the science. We know enough to sketch the outline, not enough to fill every detail. And yet the overall picture is clear. Hisarlik was not a single city destroyed in a single war, but a palimpsest of civilizations layered across millennia. The phrase, the 9 Troys, has entered the literature, but even that is a simplification. Within each of those 9 are subphases, shifts, and variations. The mound is less a sequence of discrete cities than a continuous process of human settlement, adaptation, and renewal. So what if Troy was not 1 city, but 9? Then the story changes. Instead of a sharp line between legend and history, we have a continuum. Instead of searching for a single true Troy, we confront a landscape of overlapping identities. And that leads to the haunting question. When we speak of Troy, which Troy do we mean? The humble village of 3000 before the Common Era? The fortified stronghold of the Late Bronze Age? The Roman city of Ilium visited by emperors? Or is Troy, in the end, not any one of these, but the layered memory of all of them, preserved in a hill of dirt that turned out to be the library of time itself? Can treasure prove a myth? That was the question Heinrich Schliemann believed he had answered in the 1870s when he claimed to have uncovered the glittering hoard of a Trojan king. For him, it was the ultimate vindication, a chest of gold and jewels that tied the mound of Hisarlik to stories of glory and destruction. For many others, it was a moment of astonishment. Photographs of his young wife Sophia draped in golden diadems were printed across Europe, an image of the ancient world made real. Yet beneath the drama lay a different story, one of misinterpretation, misplaced enthusiasm, and the stubborn way evidence can be bent to fit a narrative. What Schliemann called Priam's treasure turned out to be far older than any legendary war, and far less connected to the figures he imagined. It was treasure, yes, but not proof. The story begins with Schliemann's excavation at Hisarlik in the early 1870s. As he and his workers dug through the mound with their great trench, they cut into the second major layer, what modern archaeologists call Troy II. Here, among collapsed walls and burned debris, Schliemann uncovered a collection of objects that took his breath away. There were golden diadems, earrings, and pendants. There were silver vessels and copper cauldrons. There were daggers, spearheads, and an assortment of bronze tools. All told, it was an extraordinary assemblage of early Bronze Age craftsmanship, buried together in what appeared to be a deliberate deposit. For Schliemann, the conclusion was immediate. This must be the wealth of King Priam, the ruler described in epic poetry, whose city fell in flames. He published accounts describing how he spirited the treasure out of Ottoman lands in defiance of local authorities, wrapping the objects in shawls and smuggling them to safety. He staged photographs of his wife adorned with the jewels to give the discovery a human face. He wrote with the fervour of a man who believed he had unlocked the door between legend and history. The press devoured his stories. For a moment it seemed as if the mythical past had stepped into the modern world. But problems quickly appeared. Scholars examining the objects noticed that their style and technology did not match the Late Bronze Age, the time when the supposed Trojan War would have occurred. Instead, they were characteristic of the early Bronze Age, roughly 1,000 years earlier, around 2200 before the Common Era. The treasure was real, but it belonged to a city far older than the one Schliemann wanted to prove. In other words, he had found riches, but he had not found Priam. This misdating was not a minor detail. It meant that the treasure could not possibly be linked to the events that Schliemann associated with Homer's poems. It had nothing to do with the 13th or 12th centuries before the Common Era, the horizon of the Late Bronze Age. Instead, it reflected a flourishing community in a much earlier epoch, when metallurgy was advancing, long-distance trade was developing, and small fortified centres dotted Anatolia. For modern archaeology, this makes the hoard immensely valuable. It shows the wealth, artistry and connections of early Troy. But for Schliemann's original claim it was devastating. His Priam's treasure was 1,000 years too old. How the hoard came to be buried remains debated. Some suggest it was a cache hidden during an attack, never recovered by its owner. Others believe it may have been a ritual deposit, placed deliberately within the foundations of a wall. The precise context is unclear, in part because Schliemann's excavation methods disturbed the original setting. He admitted that he removed the objects quickly, sometimes without recording their exact location. In his eagerness, he may have conflated items from different strata, blending them into a single treasure that was not originally assembled that way. This makes interpretation more difficult even today. What we can say is that the collection reflects extraordinary skill. The diadems, for example, are made of delicate sheets of hammered gold, with intricate filigree work that would have required both technical knowledge and artistic vision. The silver vessels show advanced metalworking. The weapons suggest a society familiar with both warfare and ceremony. Such craftsmanship indicates that by the early Bronze Age, Troy, too, was part of a broader world of exchange and innovation. This was not an isolated village, but a community capable of commanding wealth and channeling it into symbolic objects. After Schliemann's dramatic announcement, the treasure embarked on a strange afterlife of its own. He brought it to Berlin, where it was displayed in the museum and became a sensation. Visitors marvelled at its antiquity and imagined the scenes of legend brought to life. Scholars published detailed studies debating its origins and meaning. The mislabeling as Priam's treasure persisted, partly because it was a powerful brand, partly because correcting it would have undermined the romantic narrative that had captured the public. The 20th century added another twist. During the final days of the Second World War, as the Red Army swept into Berlin, the treasure disappeared. For decades it was assumed lost, perhaps destroyed in the bombing, perhaps looted and melted down. Only in the 1990s did the truth emerge. The hoard had been taken to Moscow and hidden in the Pushkin Museum, kept secret through the Soviet era as a spoil of war. When it was finally displayed again, half a century later, it provoked renewed fascination. Visitors once more saw Sophia's diadems and Schliemann's golden cups, but now with a new layer of irony, a treasure claimed as Trojan, then German, then Soviet, then Russian. It was as if the hoard itself mirrored the contested nature of Troy, claimed by many, belonging fully to none. The lesson of this episode is not that treasure is unimportant, but that it is dangerous to equate treasure with proof of legend. Objects carry stories, but not always the stories we want them to tell. Schliemann wanted Priam, and found instead the wealth of an earlier forgotten people. His eagerness distorted his interpretation, yet without his eagerness the objects might never have been brought to light at all. The paradox of archaeology is that it depends both on passion and on caution, and when passion overwhelms caution, history is skewed. Today, scholars treat the so-called Priam's treasure as an early Bronze Age assemblage, significant in its own right. It tells us that by 2200 before the Common Era, Troy was already wealthy, already connected to wider networks, already capable of artistry that speaks across millennia. It does not tell us about Priam or Homer or any war, but perhaps that is enough. The mound of Hisarlik was occupied for centuries before any Greek poet imagined battles on its plain. Those earlier inhabitants deserve to be remembered not just as a prologue to myth, but as people in their own time, with their own artistry and ambitions. So can treasure prove a myth? The answer, as far as we know, is no. Treasure can illuminate, complicate, inspire and confuse. It can reveal the wealth of a society, the skills of its artisans, the networks of its trade, but it cannot by itself prove that a story is true. The hoard from Troy too remains one of the most beautiful finds of the Bronze Age, yet it stands apart from the narratives once attached to it. And the haunting question is this: how often do we still let the gleam of gold dictate the stories we tell about the past, seeing what we want to see rather than what the evidence truly shows? What did Troy look like before the Greeks even existed? To ask that question is to strip away centuries of myth and poetry and return to something more difficult but in many ways more fascinating: the plain evidence of archaeology. Long before any bard sang of battles on the Scamander Plain, before Achilles or Hector or even the language of Homer's Greek had taken shape, the mound of Hisarlik was already alive. Between roughly 3,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, it was a place of fishermen, farmers and traders. It was not yet legendary, but it was already unusual. When we speak of Troy in this earliest period, we are speaking of the settlement archaeologists called Troy I and Troy II. These labels sound clinical, yet behind them are generations of people who built homes, lit fires, and raised children overlooking the Dardanelles. Their world was smaller than the palaces of later ages, but in some ways it was no less connected. For the position of Hisarlik at the edge of the Hellespont gave it something few inland communities could claim: a view of the sea and access to the routes that linked Anatolia to the Aegean and beyond. The earliest settlement, Troy I, appears around 3000 before the Common Era. The remains suggest a modest community, perhaps a cluster of houses built from mud brick on stone foundations, surrounded by simple walls. The people who lived here likely relied on mixed subsistence: grain farming, herding sheep and goats, and fishing in the nearby waters. Pottery from this phase is simple but functional, with designs that already show links to other parts of Anatolia and the Balkans. Even at this early stage, Troy was not isolated. The sea was a thoroughfare, and the inhabitants looked outward as much as inward. By the time Troika emerged, around 2600 to 2500 before the Common Era, the settlement had grown more ambitious. This is the level where archaeologists uncovered a large megaron, a rectangular hall with a central hearth and an antechamber. Such a structure speaks of hierarchy. Not every community built monumental halls. Such buildings suggest leaders who could command labour and resources. Whether we call them chiefs or kings is speculation, but the architecture points to an emerging elite. The megaron stood at the centre of a fortified citadel, its thick stone walls sloping outward in the style that would become characteristic of Troy. The artefacts from Troy too show that the community was not merely subsisting but thriving. Pottery became more elaborate, with red burnished surfaces and new forms. Tools of bronze began to appear, marking the transition from stone. Most telling are the exotic materials found here. Lapis lazuli, originating from Afghanistan, travelled thousands of kilometres to arrive at this small Anatolian hill. Amber, likely from the Baltic, has also been found. Tin, crucial for making bronze, reached Troy from distant sources in Central Asia or Anatolia's highlands. These were not everyday objects. They were luxuries, prestige goods that linked Troy into the earliest long-distance trade networks of the Bronze Age. The presence of such items tells us that Troy's inhabitants were not passive recipients, but active participants in the world's first international system. The location explains much of this. The Dardanelles Strait was a bottleneck. Any ship moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass by this point. Controlling or at least occupying a settlement here meant access to traffic, goods, and ideas. Archaeologists see Troy too as a maritime community as much as an agricultural one. Its people looked to the sea for food and for wealth. They likely fished, collected shellfish, and perhaps engaged in coastal trade. Small boats could have carried them to the nearby islands of the Aegean, linking them to the Cyclades, where marble figurines and seaborne culture were flourishing. The treasure Schliemann misattributed to Priam, which we now know belongs to this early Bronze Age phase, fits this picture. The diadems, cups and tools were the possessions of a society wealthy enough to channel surplus into artistry. They suggest inequality, with elites able to accumulate and display wealth. But they also suggest contact, for the styles echo those of distant regions. In Troy too we see a world already far wider than its immediate plain. Daily life in this period would have been shaped by both opportunity and risk. The fertile soils of the Scamander Plain offered agriculture, but the same strategic location that gave access to trade also invited conflict. The fortifications of Troy, too, walls several metres thick with sloping sides, were not decorative, they were defences. Archaeology shows that the settlement was destroyed by fire around 2200 before the Common Era, leaving a thick layer of ash. Whether this was caused by invasion, internal strife, or accident remains debated. Few bodies have been found, which may indicate that people escaped. What is clear is that the city did not vanish, it was rebuilt. The continuity of occupation across these centuries is itself remarkable. Many early Bronze Age centres across Anatolia rose and fell, but Hisarlik endured. Each rebuilding left new layers, the layer cake that modern archaeologists can still trace. Each layer tells us that the mound was never forgotten. For reasons of geography and memory, people kept returning. They built again where their predecessors had built, reinforcing the sense that this hill mattered in ways beyond simple utility. It is tempting to imagine the conversations of those early Trojans, though we should be cautious even with the word Trojan, for it is our label, not theirs. They spoke languages lost to us, perhaps early Anatolian dialects or tongues now entirely vanished. They knew nothing of Greeks, who would not appear for many centuries. Their gods, if they had them, are unknown. What we see are the material traces: pots, walls, jewellery, tools. From these fragments we infer a society connected, ambitious and resilient. To walk through the ruins of Troy 1 and 2 today is to realise how deep the story runs. The walls of later cities overshadow them, yet beneath the great myths lies this quieter beginning. A fishing village becoming a trading town, a town becoming a fortified citadel, a citadel acquiring the wealth of distant lands. Long before Homer, long before poets, long before the war that may or may not have happened, there was already a community here watching ships move along the strait. The haunting question is this: when we think of Troy, do we remember only the war and the horse, or do we also remember these earlier people whose lives were not legend but reality? Their world was not less rich for lacking poetry. In their pots, their walls, and their treasures, they tell a story of how human societies first reached outward across seas, linking lands and cultures in ways that still shape our world today. Another layer of this early story lies not in Troy's riches, but in its environment. The plain below Hisarlik was watered by rivers, including the Scamander and the Simois, whose courses have shifted over millennia. In the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, they would have meandered through a wide alluvial plain, creating fertile ground for cereals and pulses. Archaeological pollen studies indicate that the area supported groves of oak and stands of pine, which could have been used for timber, fuel, and even small boat building. The inhabitants of Troy 1 and 2 were therefore not only cultivators and traders, but also managers of a landscape that offered both abundance and fragility. Floods, earthquakes, and fires were constant risks, reminding us that endurance was as much about adaptation as ambition. The houses of this early period tell us about social structure. Excavations reveal narrow lanes between modest mud brick homes, yet with the imposing megaron set apart at the centre. This arrangement implies hierarchy but also community. The citadel was compact, meaning ordinary dwellings pressed up against walls that symbolised collective defence. Inside, hearths, grinding stones and ovens speak to daily domestic rhythms, bread being baked, tools sharpened, wool spun. For the archaeologist, such details may seem mundane, yet they are what carried life forward year by year, while treasures were only occasional flourishes. We also begin to glimpse patterns of burial. Small cemeteries near the settlement show crouched inhumations in simple pits or stone cists. Grave goods include pottery vessels and personal ornaments, tokens of care for the dead, and perhaps belief in an afterlife. These early burials remind us that even in this practical society, symbolic meaning mattered. To lay the dead with goods was to imagine continuity beyond the moment of death. That strand of human imagination, the desire to anchor memory in objects, would later grow into the myths that still define Troy's reputation. One of the most intriguing aspects of early Troy is how it foreshadows what would later become central to the wider Aegean. The Megaron of Troy too anticipates architectural forms that would appear in the Mycenaean palaces 1,000 years later. The fortifications prefigure the massive walls that would later inspire tales of Cyclopean builders. Even without a direct line of inheritance, Troy's early phases illustrate how ideas travelled, adapted, and re-emerged across time. This is why archaeologists often stress the site's role not as a singular curiosity, but as part of a larger Bronze Age dialogue across the eastern Mediterranean. If one lesson emerges from Troy before Homer, it is that the mound itself held a kind of gravity. People returned again and again, layering new homes over old, treating the place as if it had a destiny of its own. We can only guess what they thought of the ruins beneath their feet, but perhaps they already felt what later generations would put into myth. That Hisarlik was not merely a hill, but a place where memory and meaning seemed to collect, waiting for the stories that would one day make it eternal. Were the Trojans really Indo-Europeans? It is a question that cuts to the heart of what Troy was before it became myth. To answer it, we must set aside later poetry and look instead at the centuries after 2000 before the Common Era, when a new world was stirring across Anatolia and the Balkans. These were the Middle Troys, archaeologically labelled Troy 4 and Troy 5, and they sit at the crossroads of language, technology and power. This was the time when horses first appeared, when bronze metallurgy advanced, and when the great Hittite kingdom began to leave records that speak, however obliquely, of a place that might have been Troy. The arrival of the horse is a telling marker. Domesticated in the steppes north of the Black Sea around 4000 before the Common Era, horses spread gradually southward. By the early second millennium they were reaching Anatolia, where they transformed both warfare and trade. Chariots were not yet widespread, but the prestige of owning and breeding horses was immense. Clay tablets from the Hittite capital of Hattusar describe elaborate horse training manuals, hinting at a society where equines were becoming a measure of power. Archaeological traces at Hisarlik are sparse, but horse bones from these centuries do appear, suggesting that even on this windswept hill by the Dardanelles, people were adapting to the equine revolution. If Troy was known for anything in these middle centuries, it may have been as a node where Indo-European-speaking newcomers and older Anatolian cultures mingled, exchanging not just goods, but ideas about mobility, warfare, and status. The Indo-European question is bound to language. By comparing ancient tongues, linguists have reconstructed a family tree stretching from Sanskrit in India to Latin in Italy. Somewhere in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, speakers of this ancestral language began spreading outward. By 2000 before the Common Era, Indo-European languages dominated Anatolia. The Hittites spoke one, as did their western neighbours, the Luwians. Both left written records, carved on clay tablets and inscribed in stone hieroglyphs. In those records appear references to lands and cities near the Dardanelles. One of these was Wilusa, a name that some scholars have linked to the later Greek word Ilion, the name Homer used for Troy. If that link is correct, then already by 1600 before the Common Era, Troy was known to the great powers of the region, and its people spoke a language close to Hittite and Luwian. But were they Indo-Europeans in origin, or something older? Archaeology cannot answer directly, but the material culture of Troy 4 and 5 suggests continuity with earlier inhabitants alongside new influences. Pottery styles shifted, with more wheel-made vessels replacing hand-shaped ones. Fortifications were rebuilt sturdier, with stone walls rising several metres high, angled outward in a style that anticipates the Cyclopean masonry of later Mycenae. Houses became more regular, laid out in blocks, suggesting urban planning. At the same time, metallurgy advanced. Bronze tools and weapons appear more frequently, signalling both improved technology and participation in the broader networks of the Bronze Age. Copper from Anatolia and tin from as far as Afghanistan or Central Asia had to converge here, making Troy a beneficiary of the trade arteries that tied together continents. Some historians have suggested that the Trojans may have been related not only to the Luwians, but also to peoples further west, perhaps the Thracians of southeastern Europe. Ancient authors occasionally hinted at such connections, and linguists have debated whether fragments of names and place words support it. The idea is that Troy, standing at the hinge of Europe and Asia, was neither wholly Anatolian nor wholly Balkan, but something hybrid, a cultural bridge. To call them Thracian might oversimplify, but it captures the intuition that the Trojans were not just an Anatolian outpost, but also a European frontier. Their architecture, their defences, and their trading patterns seem to face in both directions, across the straits and across the plains. The rise of the Hittite kingdom in central Anatolia complicates this picture. By 1700 before the Common Era, the Hittites had consolidated power, and their sphere of influence extended westward. The tablets they left behind describe campaigns, treaties, and shifting alliances with Western polities. Wilusa is mentioned among them, often as a contested territory. If Wilusa is indeed Troy, then already in the second millennium, the city was more than a fishing village or trading post. It was a political entity caught between empires. We cannot know the names of its rulers, but we can see that Hisarlik mattered enough to appear in the diplomatic records of a superpower. The physical remains of these centuries, though less dramatic than golden hordes, are eloquent in their own way. Archaeologists at Troy 4 and 5 have uncovered carefully cut limestone walls, paved streets, and storage jars sunk into floors for preserving grain and oil. These details speak to a society that valued stability and surplus, that was not merely surviving but planning. They also speak to continuity. The mound had been destroyed and rebuilt before, yet people returned, layering their homes on top of the old, as if bound to the place by memory and necessity alike. All of this raises the haunting question: who were the Trojans before the legends began? They were not Greeks, and they were not yet characters in an epic. They were likely speakers of an Anatolian Indo-European language, perhaps related to Luwian, perhaps touched by Thracian neighbours. They bred horses, worked bronze, traded with lands hundreds of kilometres away, and built fortifications that proclaimed permanence. To stand in the ruins of Troy 4 and 5 is to glimpse a city that was both local and cosmopolitan, both modest and ambitious. It was here, in this crucible of Indo-European expansion and Anatolian tradition, that the seeds of the later legend were planted. The myths came later, but the ground on which they would grow was already being laid, stone by stone, horse by horse, word by word. The question of identity becomes even more complicated when we remember that language does not always map neatly onto people. The Indo-European languages that swept Anatolia left written traces in Luwian and Hittite, but the inhabitants of Troy may have been bilingual or even multilingual. Traders at the Strait would have needed to bargain with sailors from the Aegean, with merchants from central Anatolia, and perhaps with emissaries from as far as Mesopotamia. It is possible that a resident of Troy in 1600 before the Common Era could shift tongues depending on who was standing across the table. In that sense, the Trojans may not have thought of themselves as belonging to one language family at all. They were pragmatic, and pragmatism is often what keeps a settlement alive for centuries. Archaeological hints reinforce this cosmopolitan picture. Cylinder seals of Mesopotamian type have been found in levels associated with this period, small objects carved with motifs that would have been immediately recognisable to a trader from the Tigris or Euphrates. They are out of place on the shores of the Dardanelles, yet their very presence speaks to Troy's role in the broader web of exchange. Alongside them appear local imitations, as if artisans at Hisarlik had learned the style and adapted it for their own markets. Such blending of influences is often how culture works. A foreign form arrives, is admired, copied, and slowly becomes local. The metallurgy of the time also tells a story. Workshops produced not only functional bronze tools but also decorative pins, ornaments and blades. These were signs of both status and skill. What is striking is the standardization, weights and measures that hint at regulation, at a society that had begun to formalize trade. To keep bronze flowing required agreements, shared expectations, and perhaps even early institutions of authority. While we cannot call Troy a state in this period, we can say that it was more than a village. It was a hub with systems that echoed those of the larger polities around it. And yet the mound was never entirely secure. Earthquakes shook the region, leaving signs of collapsed walls in the archaeological layers. Fire-scarred buildings, whether through accident or conflict, remains unclear. Each time, rebuilding followed. That cycle of destruction and renewal seems to have shaped Troy's identity as much as trade or language. A community that endures repeated catastrophe develops traditions of resilience, knowledge of how to salvage, how to repair, how to continue. Perhaps this is why Troy's story lingered in memory long after other settlements of similar size were forgotten. The Indo-European migrations, the arrival of horses, the diplomacy of the Hittites, all these threads intersect at Hisarlik. But what is most striking is not just the external forces, but the local persistence. Troy endured not by being the largest or most powerful city of its age, but by remaining necessary, positioned at a crossing that no empire or traveller could ignore. That necessity, carried forward across centuries, set the stage for the legends that would one day make its name immortal. Who are the Greeks across the sea? To understand Troy at its height, we must also understand the power that grew in parallel on the western side of the Aegean. For as the Anatolian citadel was being fortified, a new civilization was rising on the Greek mainland. By 1600 before the Common Era, Mycenae and its sister palatial centres began to emerge from obscurity, leaving behind graves, walls, and treasures that revealed a society both wealthy and martial. It was these people, the Mycenaeans, who would eventually dominate the Greek world and later be remembered in legend as the ones who launched 1,000 ships. But before they became characters in epic poetry, they were a Bronze Age society shaped by trade, warfare, and a hunger for prestige. The story begins with graves. At Mycenae in the Peloponnese, archaeologists uncovered shaft graves dating to around 1600 before the Common Era. These were deep pits cut into bedrock, filled with the remains of elite individuals and accompanied by spectacular grave goods. Golden masks, inlaid daggers, and finely crafted cups spoke of wealth and craftsmanship. Among these finds was the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, unearthed by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. Schliemann believed he had found the face of the legendary king who would later command the Greeks at Troy. Modern scholars have shown that the mask predates any such figure by several centuries. It belongs instead to the earlier lords of Mycenae, men whose names we will never know. Yet the mask remains emblematic of a society that invested enormous effort into honouring its dead, equipping them for an afterlife with symbols of power. The shaft graves were more than burial places. They were statements. They announced to the living that here lay rulers whose wealth derived from control of resources and networks that stretched across the Aegean. Gold from Egypt, amber from the north, and lapis from the east all found their way into these graves. The Mycenaeans were not isolated warriors. They were plugged into the same trade routes that enriched Troy. The difference was scale. Mycenae's rulers had begun to centralize power, building palatial complexes that coordinated production, storage, and distribution. Clay tablets inscribed with Linear B script, an early form of Greek, record lists of grain, wine, and livestock. They reveal a bureaucracy capable of counting and controlling resources, the mark of a true state. By 1400 before the Common Era, the Mycenaeans had constructed massive fortifications around their citadels. The walls at Mycenae and Tiryns are built from enormous blocks of limestone, fitted together without mortar. Later Greeks, seeing their sheer scale, believed they must have been constructed by giants, the Cyclopes. Modern archaeologists call them Cyclopean walls for the same reason. These fortifications speak not only to defensive needs, but also to display. To approach a Mycenaean citadel was to be awed by stonework that dwarfed human scale. They projected permanence and authority, a clear message to allies and rivals alike. Life inside the citadels combined luxury with administration. Storerooms held jars of oil and wine, carefully sealed and accounted for. Workshops produced fine pottery and elaborate weapons. Frescoes adorned walls with scenes of hunting, processions, and ritual. The elite lived surrounded by symbols of their control, while commoners in the surrounding countryside laboured to support them. The Mycenaeans were a warrior society. Their graves are filled with swords and armour, and their art frequently depicts combat. Yet they were also builders, scribes, and traders. This duality, violence and sophistication, defined their character. The Mycenaean world was not limited to Mycenae alone. Palatial centres at Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns shared similar architecture and practices, suggesting a network of related kingdoms. Each had its own ruler, but they shared culture, script, and connections. Together, they formed what we now call the Mycenaean civilization. Their ships sailed across the Aegean, trading with Crete, Cyprus, and Anatolia. They adopted elements of Minoan culture, including art and perhaps aspects of religion, blending them into their own traditions. By the 13th century before the Common Era, they were among the dominant powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. This was the world that stood opposite Troy across the sea. While Troy guarded the straits linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, the Mycenaeans controlled fertile plains, trade routes, and fleets of ships. It is not difficult to see how these two powers might eventually clash. Yet for centuries, their interaction was likely more trade than war. Mycenaean pottery has been found in western Anatolia, and Anatolian goods appear in Greek contexts. The relationship was complex, a mixture of rivalry and exchange. The haunting question is whether the rise of Mycenae set the stage for the later legends of war. When we read of golden masks and cyclopean walls, are we glimpsing the prototypes of kings and armies that later poets would elevate into myth? We cannot know. What we can say is that by 1200 before the Common Era, two worlds faced each other across the Aegean: Troy, fortified on its hill above the Dardanelles, and Mycenae, walled and powerful in the Peloponnese. The stage was set for encounters that would echo long after both societies had collapsed. If the graves and walls of Mycenae speak of power, the smaller artefacts whisper of how deeply interconnected this civilization had become. Archaeologists have uncovered seal stones with intricate carvings of lions, griffins, and abstract spirals, tiny objects used to stamp clay and mark ownership. Their designs echo motifs from Crete and even the Near East, suggesting that Mycenaean elites were consciously collecting and adapting foreign symbols to project legitimacy. Jewellery found in burials includes faience beads from Egypt, while carved ivories likely originated in Syria. These items are not accidental imports. They reveal a ruling class eager to display their role in a cosmopolitan Bronze Age. To stand before a Mycenaean warrior bedecked with such items was to see not only a fighter, but a man claiming ties to distant lands and powers. Religious life at Mycenae also carries hints of later Greek traditions. Linear B tablets mention offerings to deities whose names resemble those of gods known from classical times. Figures such as Poseidon and Hera may already have been worshipped in palatial shrines, yet alongside them appear unfamiliar divine names, deities lost to history. This suggests a fluid religious landscape where imported cults and local spirits mingled. Shrines with altars and figurines have been excavated, showing that ritual was woven into daily life. Sacrifices of animals, libations of wine, and offerings of grain anchored the relationship between the rulers and the supernatural. Religion in this world was not separate from politics. It legitimized authority and sanctified war. One of the more striking insights comes from evidence of craft specialization. Smiths, potters, and textile workers are recorded in the Linear B tablets, each tied to the palace economy. Workshops produce standardized goods, from wheel-made pottery painted with marine motifs to fine woolen cloth destined for trade. This was not random cottage industry. It was a managed system, controlled by administrators who allocated raw materials and tracked output. Such organisation speaks to a society where hierarchy ran deep and the palace acted as the economic heart. Common farmers grew grain and raised sheep, but much of their surplus flowed into storerooms, from which it was redistributed under the eye of scribes. It is tempting to think of the Mycenaeans as a purely martial culture, defined by their swords and walls, but the evidence shows something more subtle, a civilization balancing violence with administration, seafaring with bureaucracy, tradition with innovation. Their leaders cultivated the image of warrior kings, yet they were also managers of an economy that stretched across the Aegean. That dual identity may help explain why later, memory cast them both as brutal besiegers and as founders of Greek civilization. The unresolved question is how much of this self-image survived in oral tradition after the palaces fell. When Homer sang of bronze-clad heroes centuries later, was he echoing a real Mycenaean ethos of glory and wealth? Or was he reinventing them from fragments that had drifted down through time? The palatial centres themselves offer no answer, but their stones, graves, and objects hint at a society already larger than life, perhaps just large enough to leave shadows in myth. What was Homer really doing when he sang of Troy? Was he recalling a memory carried across 5 centuries, or was he inventing a new past from fragments of rumour ritual, and performance? This question sits at the heart of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two poems that became the foundation of Western literature, yet whose origins remain deeply uncertain. To even speak of Homer is to walk into a thicket of speculation, because the man himself is almost invisible to us. We have no firm biography, no verified portrait, not even clear agreement on whether a single poet was responsible for the works, or whether Homer was a collective label for generations of singers. Tradition places him in the 8th century before the Common Era, perhaps around the year 700, in an Ionian city along the coast of Asia Minor, somewhere between Smyrna and Chios. But these are guesses. What we can say is that by the time these poems were written down, they carried with them the weight of centuries of oral tradition stretching back toward the world of the Late Bronze Age. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not born as books, but as performances. For centuries before Homer, bards known as oidoi memorized and improvised stories in rhythm and meter, accompanied by the plucking of the lyre. These performers relied on formulaic phrases, stock epithets like rosy-fingered dawn or swift-footed, to maintain the meter and to aid memory. Far from lazy repetition, this was a sophisticated system for building long narratives without writing. A skilled singer could adjust a story to fit the audience, expand or compress episodes, and weave local legends into the fabric of an inherited epic. This flexibility allowed myths of different regions and wars to merge into composite traditions. What Homer, or the poets who bore his name, achieved was to take this living performance culture and give it a scale and coherence beyond what had existed before. When we ask whether Homer was remembering Troy, what we really mean is whether oral tradition can preserve genuine details across half a millennium. Some scholars argue that memory of the Late Bronze Age world, with its palaces and warriors, could have survived in fragments through songs, rituals, and genealogies passed down in families. Others point out that oral traditions tend to adapt to contemporary concerns, meaning that what was sung in the 8th century before the Common Era reflected just as much the political landscape of that time as it did any memory of a 12th century world. The poet or poets we call Homer may have inherited kernels of truth, names of places, memories of great cities destroyed by fire, echoes of Bronze Age weaponry. But they reshaped these fragments into stories that made sense for their audiences who lived in a world of small city-states competing for honour and survival. The Iliad is striking in that it does not recount the beginning or the end of the Trojan War. Instead, it narrows its focus to a few weeks in the 10th year of fighting, concentrating on the wrath of a single warrior and the chain of consequences that follow. This narrative choice makes the Iliad less a chronicle of a war and more a meditation on anger, pride, and mortality. By contrast, the Odyssey is about return and resilience. It takes the frame of war but shifts focus to wandering, cleverness, and endurance. The Iliad is sharp, tragic, and unflinching. The Odyssey is episodic, inventive, and even playful. Together they offer complementary views of what it meant to be human, in a world where violence and fate were ever present. That difference in tone might also reflect different layers of tradition. The Iliad feels closer to the Bronze Age ethos of chariots, duels, and honour codes, while the Odyssey is more attuned to the world of sailors, traders, and colonists that characterise the 8th century. One poem may preserve deeper echoes of an older warrior culture. The other may showcase the anxieties of a seafaring society pushing into new frontiers. Both, however, are the products of oral tradition shaped for performance in communal settings, sung in palaces, courts, and festivals, where audiences listened as much for rhythm and familiarity as for novelty. The process by which these oral performances became fixed texts is still debated. Some suggest that the poems were dictated to scribes in Homer's lifetime, using the newly adopted Greek alphabet. Others believe they continued as fluid oral compositions for generations, only being solidified into written form later, perhaps during the rule of Pisistratus in Athens in the 6th century before the Common Era. Either way, what began as sung tradition eventually became literary canon, but not without transformation. In the act of writing down, the poem shifted from living, evolving performances to fixed texts, opening them to study, commentary, and recitation across the Mediterranean. To the ancient Greeks, the question of whether Homer remembered or invented may not have mattered. For them, the poems were authoritative, shaping their understanding of the past and their sense of identity. Heroes were not simply characters in a story, but ancestors, role models, and cautionary figures. The Iliad and Odyssey were used as textbooks for moral lessons, rhetorical exercises, and cultural identity. By the classical period, Homer was less a poet than a pillar of collective memory. Yet for us, living thousands of years later, the question lingers: did Homer's words contain genuine memories of the Bronze Age? Or were they brilliant inventions crafted to give an audience the illusion of deep antiquity? Perhaps the truth lies in between, fragments of history preserved in amber, reshaped and reframed by the needs of each generation of singers until they reach the form we now read. Oral tradition is neither a perfect archive nor pure fantasy. It is a living medium, carrying some details forward while transforming others beyond recognition. The haunting question is not just whether Homer remembered Troy, but how much of what we call history is really collective memory, reshaped through centuries of retelling. When we listen to the Iliad, are we hearing the last echoes of a lost world, or are we simply hearing ourselves, reflected back through the lens of poets who knew that memory and invention are never truly separate? Did the gods themselves fight on the dusty plain before Troy? When we open the Iliad, we find not only warriors and kings, but deities striding across the battlefield, hurling spears, deflecting blows, and sometimes even suffering wounds. To modern readers, this mingling of divine and human can seem strange, yet for the Greeks who first heard Homer's song, it was a natural way of explaining both the chaos of war and the meaning of existence. Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and Aphrodite do not hover as distant abstractions. They enter the fray with all the intensity of mortal combatants, embodying forces that humans felt in their bones. Zeus sits at the centre of the poem's divine drama. He is the Sky Father, the wielder of thunderbolts, who claims ultimate authority over gods and men. Yet in the Iliad, he is not an all-powerful controller, but a ruler who negotiates, listens, and sometimes bends to the wishes of other gods, or to the dictates of fate. His presence reminds us that in the Greek view, even the greatest power is constrained by something higher, whether that is destiny, time, or the mysterious order of the cosmos. When Zeus weighs the fates of heroes on his golden scales, he represents the inevitability of death and the balance that must be maintained in the world. Athena plays a different role. She's the goddess of wisdom and strategy, the patroness of cities, and in the Iliad she constantly intervenes to favour the Greeks. She restrains warriors in moments of madness, steadies their hands, and whispers counsel. Unlike Zeus, she is not distant. She leans into the ear of fighters, giving them courage and focus. Her presence on the battlefield embodies the ideal of measured strength, the ability to channel violence into disciplined action. For the Greeks who told and retold these stories, Athena symbolised the belief that intelligence and order could stand against chaos. She's not merely a character, she's the principle that war can be guided by reason. Apollo, in contrast, champions the Trojans. He is the archer god, sending plague with his arrows and sheltering warriors under his divine shield. His role reminds us that the gods of Homer were not impartial judges but participants with their own loyalties and grudges. When Apollo strikes down Greek warriors, the audience does not question the morality of his actions. They see in him the embodiment of forces that humans cannot control: disease, sudden death, the unpredictable turns of battle. To place Apollo on the Trojan side is to acknowledge that calamity can fall even on the strongest without warning or justice. Perhaps most surprising is the role of Aphrodite. Known in later tradition as the goddess of love and desire, she enters the battlefield to protect her favoured Trojan prince. In Homer's telling, she is far less invincible than other deities, even suffering a wound from a mortal spear. Her vulnerability may seem odd, but it reflects how the Greeks understood love and beauty, not as safe abstractions, but as powerful, dangerous, and sometimes humiliating forces. To invoke Aphrodite in the Iliad is to recognise that desire and attachment can drive humans to war as much as ambition or pride. The interplay of these gods on the battlefield is not random storytelling flourish. It reveals how the Greeks conceived of divine presence in the world. For them, the gods were not remote figures beyond human experience, but powers immanent in every aspect of life. War, in its fury and unpredictability, was the arena where those powers became most visible. When a warrior fought with uncanny strength, that was Athena guiding his arm. When sudden terror broke an army, that was Apollo's shadow falling across the plain. When men fought for the possession of a woman, that was Aphrodite's unseen hand shaping their choices. We should not imagine that listeners in the 8th century before the Common Era thought of these divine episodes as literal in the way modern readers seek literal truth. Rather, they heard in them symbolic explanations, dramatizations of the forces that shape human life. The gods in Homer are not omniscient beings dictating every outcome. They are personifications of human experience, given form and voice so that audiences could grasp the invisible through story. In this sense, the Iliad's divine machinery is less about theology and more about anthropology. It shows us how a society understood itself and the world. The presence of the gods also carried a ritual resonance. The Greeks lived in a culture where sacrifice, libation and prayer were woven into the fabric of daily existence. To tell a story without divine intervention would have felt incomplete, even meaningless. By placing Zeus, Athena, Apollo and Aphrodite at the heart of his tale, Homer was not inventing but reflecting a worldview where the divine was always near. These interventions reinforced the idea that humans were never alone in their struggles. They fought, suffered and died under the gaze and sometimes the touch of powers greater than themselves. And yet, despite all this divine presence, the Iliad does not absolve mortals of responsibility. Even when a god inspires a hero to fight, it is still the human who bears the consequences. The gods can wound or heal, but they cannot erase the fundamental truth that every man who enters battle risks death. In this way, the Iliad maintains a delicate balance. The gods dramatize the forces of life, but human choices remain central. So when we ask if the gods truly fought at Troy, the answer depends on how we define truth. Historically, of course, we have no evidence that deities hurled spears or bled on the plain. But within the cultural truth of Homer's world, the gods were as real as the sun and sea. They were the grammar of existence, the language in which Greeks explained what they felt but could not see. The haunting question is whether our own modern stories are really so different. When we speak of luck, fate, or chance, are we not also invoking unseen powers to make sense of what overwhelms us? Perhaps the gods of Olympus have only changed their names. If we look closely, the gods in the Iliad also function as mirrors of human society. Zeus presides over the divine assembly, much like a king attempting to arbitrate among quarrelsome nobles. Athena is the strategist, echoing the importance of counsel and planning in the political life of Greek city-states. Apollo, aligned with archery and sudden illness, recalls the dread of epidemics that could devastate entire communities. Even Aphrodite's vulnerability in battle can be seen as a reflection of how fragile beauty and passion were when weighed against violence. For audiences steeped in ritual life, these portrayals were not simply fanciful additions to a war story. They were a way of embedding cultural truths into narrative form. The gods' interventions also underscored the importance of ritual obligations. In Homer's time, communities sacrificed animals, poured libations, and built shrines to curry favour with divine powers. The Iliad dramatizes what might happen if those relationships were ignored or disrespected. When a priest of Apollo is dishonored, the god responds with plague arrows. When Zeus feels slighted, the balance of battle shifts. These episodes are less theological instruction than narrative reinforcement of social norms. Honor the gods, or risk calamity. What makes Homer's vision distinctive is the blending of human-like behaviour with immense power. The gods squabble, deceive, and play favourites in ways that feel recognisably petty, yet their whims can decide the fate of cities. This duality captured the paradox of ancient belief. The divine was at once relatable and terrifying, familiar and unfathomable. It also raised uncomfortable questions. If gods could be capricious and partial, what did that mean for justice in the world? Did success belong to the virtuous, or merely to those with the right divine allies? The Iliad does not answer. It leaves the tension unresolved, reflecting the uncertainties of life itself. Archaeology adds another layer. Excavations across the Aegean have uncovered altars, figurines, and inscriptions that show the gods named in Homer were worshipped centuries before the poems were written down. Poseidon, Hera, and Zeus appear in linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces, suggesting continuity between Bronze Age religion and later epic. That continuity implies Homer did not invent a pantheon whole cloth, but inherited and reworked traditions that were already ancient. The battlefield gods of the Iliad thus connect us not only to the world of 8th century audiences, but also to the lived religion of peoples who had long vanished. What remains haunting is the way these divine figures continue to feel alive in the poem. Even now, when most of us no longer sacrifice to Athena or fear Apollo's arrows, the scenes where gods stride into battle carry a strange resonance. Perhaps it is because they reveal a truth that transcends belief. When humans face chaos, they personify it, give it a name, and tell stories about it. Whether we call it fate, chance, or the will of Zeus, we are still searching for meaning in forces we cannot master. Was Helen truly the most beautiful woman in the world, or was she an idea, an allegory wrapped in human form? The story of Troy, as it has come down to us, turns upon her figure. She is the spark, the justification, the shimmering prize over which empires clash. Yet when we look closely at her role, it becomes harder to know whether she was meant to be a person at all. She might be less an individual and more a symbol, of fertility, of wealth, of contested alliances, or perhaps even of the perilous power of desire itself. The earliest layers of her myth are ambiguous. In some traditions she's abducted by Paris, the Prince of Troy, taken against her will from her husband's palace in Sparta. In others she goes willingly, seduced by promises of passion or divine intervention. This ambiguity is crucial. It allows her to carry multiple meanings at once: victim and traitor, treasure and burden, catalyst and scapegoat. For later audiences, this uncertainty could be read in many ways. Was Helen an innocent pawn of the gods, or was she the embodiment of destructive desire? The answer depends as much on the listener as on the storyteller. To think of her as a metaphor is not to strip her of humanity, but to recognise how myth worked in antiquity. Fertility goddesses and queens often became personifications of entire cities or regions. When a woman was abducted in story, it could stand for the seizure of territory or the breaking of an alliance. In this light, Helen may represent more than a runaway bride. She could symbolise the contested control of the Aegean, the fragile bonds between rival kingdoms, or even the fertility of the land itself. Her abduction could be a poetic way of framing the seizure of wealth and resources that fueled Bronze Age warfare. Paris, too, occupies a space between history and symbolism. In the epic, he is no great warrior, but a man marked by desire and poor judgment. He is the one who accepts the fateful gift from the goddess of love, and in doing so places his city under a curse. For audiences in archaic Greece, he would have embodied the figure of the scapegoat, the prince whose personal weakness brings ruin to his people. His role shifts the blame from larger social causes, competition for trade, the collapse of alliances, onto the shoulders of a single flawed man. It is easier, after all, to tell a story about one reckless seducer than about decades of geopolitical tension. Archaeology cannot tell us whether Helen or Paris ever lived, but it does reveal the political world in which their story makes sense. Marriages among ruling houses were not private affairs but public treaties, binding entire communities together. To steal or lose a queen was to fracture a political alliance. The abduction of Helen, whether fact or metaphor, resonates with what we know of the Late Bronze Age. Fragile coalitions of kings bound by marriages, trade and oaths, always at risk of collapse. If a queen defected or was taken, war was often the result. What lingers is the strange endurance of Helen's image. She has been read as the ultimate femme fatale, as the innocent victim of divine schemes, as a goddess in disguise, and even as a phantom conjured to explain a war whose real causes were forgotten. Each age reinvents her to reflect its anxieties about beauty, loyalty, and responsibility. Was she the face that launched 1,000 ships, or a story invented to explain why fleets really sailed east in search of power? Perhaps both. Myths, like wars, rarely have a single cause, and so Helen and Paris stand in the middle of the Trojan cycle not only as characters but as ideas. She is the embodiment of contested desire, he is the emblem of flawed choice. They remind us that myths do not need to be true to be powerful. they need only to make sense of what would otherwise be chaos. Whether there was a Spartan queen who crossed the Aegean we cannot know, but that the story endured tells us something undeniable. People then, as now, understood that sometimes it takes only one figure, one decision, to change the fate of nations. The haunting question is whether we remember them because they were real, or whether we made them real because we needed someone to blame. The question of Helen's presence in Troy fascinated not only Homeric audiences, but also later poets and philosophers who struggled with the morality of her tale. Was it just to blame a single woman for a decade of slaughter? By the 5th century before the Common Era, alternative versions began to circulate. One of the most striking came from the poet Stesichorus, who suggested that Helen had never even reached Troy. Instead, according to his telling, she remained in Egypt, while a phantom double, a kind of illusion created by the gods, was carried off by Paris. The war then was waged not over a real woman but over a mirage. This idea may seem bizarre to us, but it shows how ancient thinkers sought to resolve the tension between Helen's destructive reputation and the possibility of her innocence. Euripides, the playwright of classical Athens, explored this theme with unsettling brilliance in his tragedy Helen. In his version, the real Helen is an exile in Egypt, while the Greeks and Trojans waste their strength fighting over her phantom. The war becomes a parable of human folly. Men kill and die not for truth but for an image, a shadow of desire. Such reinterpretations highlight how malleable myth was in the ancient world. The story of Helen and Paris was not fixed but constantly reshaped to suit different cultural anxieties, whether about female agency, the futility of war, or the reliability of appearances. Even philosophers could not leave Helen alone. Gorgias, a sophist of the 5th century, wrote a speech in her defence, arguing that if she was compelled by the gods, or overwhelmed by the irresistible force of love, she could not be held responsible. His rhetorical exercise may have been playful, but it touches on questions still debated today. Where does responsibility end when overwhelming forces, be they divine, social or emotional, come into play? Helen, in this sense, was less a woman, and more a test case for the boundaries of human freedom. Archaeological evidence provides another lens, though it does not give us Helen herself. In Mycenaean palaces, women of high rank appear in Linear B tablets as recipients of rations and textile workers under their supervision. These records remind us that queens and princesses were not ornamental figures. They were nodes in the economic and political web of their time. A marriage across kingdoms was a contract, and a queen's movement between palaces could alter alliances and trade routes. When the myth says Helen was taken from Sparta to Troy, we might read it as a dramatization of such shifts. It is not the biography of one woman, but the symbolic retelling of how fragile the bonds between states could be. Paris's role in all this is equally revealing. He is rarely depicted as a formidable warrior, more often as a figure of weakness or irresponsibility. In the Iliad, he is rebuked even by his own family for bringing disaster on Troy. His love for Helen may be genuine, but it is presented as reckless, selfish, and ultimately ruinous. To later Greeks, Paris became an archetype of poor leadership, the ruler who cannot restrain his appetites, the prince whose personal choices doom his people. Through him, the myth shifts responsibility away from structural causes and onto the figure of an individual scapegoat. It is easier to say Paris caused the war than to confront the deeper truths about power struggles and economic competition in the Bronze Age. And yet, even in his weakness, Paris embodies an uncomfortable reality. Human societies often hinge on personal decisions made by the few. A single marriage alliance, a single insult, a single act of betrayal can trigger wars whose costs spiral far beyond the intentions of their originators. Helen and Paris endure in story not only because they are beautiful or tragic, but because they dramatize the terrifying disproportion between personal choice and collective consequence. In the end, whether we treat them as historical figures, mythical archetypes, or metaphors for broader cultural anxieties, Helen and Paris remind us of how myth operates at the crossroads of truth and imagination. They are remembered not because they were necessarily real, but because their story carries truths that reach beyond biography. Desire can destabilize kingdoms, alliances can fracture over love or its illusion, and societies then as now often look for a face to blame when larger forces spin out of control. The haunting question is whether the war for Helen was ever about her at all, or whether she was simply the mask through which ancient storytellers tried to explain the inescapable cycles of human conflict. Why does an entire war hinge on one man's rage? When the Iliad opens, it does not begin with the fall of Troy or with the gods choosing sides. It begins with anger, specifically the anger of Achilles. Homer calls on the muse to sing of this rage, a fury so intense that it shapes the destiny of armies. In a war fought by thousands, the story turns on a single quarrel between two men, Achilles, the unmatched warrior, and Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek host. Their conflict is not about strategy or territory, but about honour, and the way that quarrel unfolds offers us one of the earliest explorations of pride, leadership, and the costs of wounded ego. Agamemnon, as leader of the Greek coalition, represents authority. He is not the strongest fighter, but he holds the power to command. When a priest of Apollo comes to ransom his captured daughter, Agamemnon refuses and insults him. The god responds with a plague, and the Greek leaders press Agamemnon to relent. He does, but his authority feels diminished. In retaliation, he seizes a prize of honour from Achilles, a woman taken in war. This act is less about desire and more about symbolic power. In the world of the Iliad, warriors are rewarded with visible tokens of esteem. To strip Achilles of his prize is to strip him of status. Achilles' response is absolute. He withdraws from battle, refusing to fight. More than that, he calls upon his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, to intercede with Zeus so that the Trojans may gain the upper hand until the Greeks come to regret dishonouring him. His anger is personal, but its consequences are collective. The greatest warrior abandons his comrades, and the tide of war shifts. For Homer's audience, this is not only a story about battlefield drama, but a reflection on the dangerous tension between personal pride and communal need. The rage of Achilles has layers. On one level, it is about insult, a slight to honour that cannot be tolerated. On another, it reflects the fragility of human life. Achilles knows he is fated to die young if he pursues glory at Troy. Every decision he makes is shadowed by the awareness of mortality. His anger at Agamemnon is fueled by the knowledge that his short life must mean something, and if his honour is stripped away, then even glory loses its value. In this sense, Achilles is not simply petulant. He embodies the existential crisis of warriors who know that death is near and who demand recognition as the only defence against oblivion. The Iliad dwells on the consequences of his rage in poetic detail. Without Achilles, the Greeks falter. The battlefield fills with scenes of suffering, but Achilles remains apart, brooding by his ships. Homer does not portray him as noble in these moments, but as dangerous in his isolation. He is both essential and destructive, the man whose absence reshapes history. The quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles thus becomes more than a narrative device. It is a study of how pride, ego, and wounded honour can endanger entire communities. One of the most haunting symbols associated with Achilles is his shield. Forged by the god Hephaestus at the request of Thetis, it is described in one of the most famous passages of the Iliad. The shield is not only a piece of armour, but a vision of the world. It depicts cities at peace and at war, farmers ploughing fields, dancers circling in joy, constellations glittering in the sky. In the midst of a poem about war, this moment broadens the frame to encompass the fullness of human life. The shield reminds us that Achilles, for all his rage, carries with him the weight of the entire human condition. When he fights, it is as if the world itself is drawn into combat. The quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon also raises questions about leadership. Agamemnon acts as commander, but his decisions are driven by insecurity and the need to assert dominance. Achilles acts as warrior, but his choices are governed by personal pride and the pursuit of eternal fame. Neither man represents the ideal of selfless leadership. Instead, Homer presents us with flawed figures whose failings have catastrophic consequences. Perhaps this was the point. For audiences in archaic Greece, the Iliad may have served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ego, even among the most celebrated leaders. We should not expect archaeology to give us direct evidence for Achilles or Agamemnon. What we do have are the echoes of a warrior ethos in the grave goods of Mycenaean princes, in the weapons buried beside them, and in the palatial records that speak of kings and their entourages. These findings suggest a world where personal honour and prestige were indeed central, where disputes among elites could destabilise alliances. In this sense, the quarrel in the Iliad, even if mythical, reflects the social realities of the late Bronze Age. What remains unresolved is the ultimate meaning of Achilles' rage. Was Homer suggesting that personal pride is always destructive? Or was he acknowledging that without such fierce individuals no war could be won? The poem refuses to offer an easy answer. Instead, it leaves us with a haunting paradox. The man whose anger nearly destroys his people is also the one upon whom their survival depends. The story of Achilles and Agamemnon reminds us that war is not only about enemies across the battlefield, it is also about the battles within, between pride and duty, between glory and survival, between the desire to be remembered and the need to belong. What is remarkable about Achilles' anger is how it refused to die with him. Long after Homer's audiences first heard the words sung, the quarrel with Agamemnon continued to echo across cultures. Later Greeks used the episode as a mirror for their own debates about power and obedience. Philosophers asked whether the greatest danger to a community came from external enemies or from discord among its own leaders. Playwrights wove Achilles into their tragedies, not only as a warrior, but as a man undone by his inability to reconcile pride with necessity. In this sense, his rage became a kind of case study in political failure, a reminder that disunity could undo even the mightiest coalition. The Romans too could not leave Achilles alone. For them he was both a figure to admire and a cautionary tale. Virgil in the Aeneid set his own hero, Aeneas, against the memory of Achilles. Where Achilles raged and withdrew, Aeneas was meant to endure and persist, carrying his people to a new destiny in Italy. Roman readers were asked to see the contrast as a moral lesson. The Roman way of persistence and duty opposed to the Greek way of consuming wrath. Yet even as they distanced themselves, Roman generals were fascinated by Achilles' ferocity. Alexander the Great centuries earlier had already visited what he believed to be Achilles' tomb, laying a wreath there before launching his own campaigns. In doing so, he aligned himself with the figure who embodied unmatched but tragic glory. Even outside politics, the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles became a shorthand for the hazards of ego. Medieval writers, rediscovering Homer through Latin translations, read the story as an allegory of Christian vice. Achilles' wrath became an example of anger unchecked, one of the deadly sins. Agamemnon's arrogance stood as a lesson in the dangers of pride. Later still, Renaissance poets admired the poetry of Homer, while also wrestling with the moral puzzle. Could such destructive anger be justified if it led to heroic deeds? Modern readers often approach Achilles with ambivalence. On the one hand, he is compelling, perhaps the most vividly human character in the Iliad. On the other, he is deeply unsettling. His refusal to fight leads to countless deaths. His eventual return to battle is marked by excess, a slaughter so intense that even the river god rises against him. The quarrel with Agamemnon therefore frames not just the beginning of the poem, but its tragic momentum. If he had not withdrawn, the war might have taken another shape, but then there would have been no Iliad, no meditation on the costs of pride. What lingers most is the sense of recognition. We may not live in a world of bronze weapons and divine interventions, but the tensions between leaders, the conflicts between ego and responsibility, remain stubbornly familiar. Achilles' anger at Agamemnon forces us to ask questions that still matter. What do leaders owe to those they command? How much should personal honour weigh against collective survival? And what happens when the strongest voice in the room decides to remain silent? It is perhaps this unresolved quality that keeps the quarrel alive. It is not merely a story about two men in a distant age. It is about the fragility of human cooperation, the way alliances can fracture from within, and the reality that sometimes the greatest threat comes not from the enemy's walls, but from the fire smouldering in one's own camp. Why does Hector linger in memory as the noblest of the Trojans, when so many other names from Homer's song fade into the background of battle lists and shifting alliances? Perhaps it's because he represents something Achilles never could, a man caught not in the pursuit of rage, but in the web of responsibility. Where Achilles embodies the fury of individual glory, Hector stands for duty, to his father, his city, his soldiers, and most of all his family. He is the man who stays behind when the walls shake, who faces enemies stronger than himself because he has no other choice. His story is less about invincibility and more about inevitability. Hector, unlike Achilles, is not semi-divine. He is not shielded by the river Styx nor granted armour by the gods. He is a mortal warrior fighting in a war he did not choose, bound by his role as heir to Priam and commander of Troy's forces. This makes him both more vulnerable and more relatable. His valour is not the product of supernatural gifts, but of commitment to a cause larger than himself. He becomes, in Homer's hands, the model of the besieged defender. For the Greeks, he was an opponent, but for audiences centuries later he often appears more admirable than his conqueror. One of the most haunting scenes in the Iliad is not a battle, but a quiet moment within the city walls. Hector meets his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax on the ramparts. Andromache begs him to withdraw, to think of their child, to spare himself for her sake. She describes her terror that Troy will fall, that she will be enslaved, and that their son will grow up without a father. Hector listens, but he cannot accept her plea. He explains that his honour and his role demand that he fight, even though he knows that Troy is fated to fall and that his own death is certain. He reaches for his son, who recoils at the sight of his helmet. The image is unforgettable. The warrior, feared even by his own child, standing at the boundary between family and war. When he removes the helmet and lifts the boy into his arms, smiling through the dread, we glimpse the man beneath the armour. This tension between Hector, the family man, and Hector, the defender, runs through the epic. He's constantly drawn between the pull of the household and the demands of the battlefield. Unlike Achilles, who withdraws in anger, Hector cannot simply step aside. His duty compels him forward, even against enemies he knows he cannot overcome. His confrontation with Ajax, his command over the Trojan troops, and finally his duel with Achilles all demonstrate this tragic necessity. The contrast with Achilles becomes sharpest in their final encounter. While Achilles rages with almost inhuman ferocity, Hector stands outside the walls knowing that to retreat into the city would mean shame and ruin. He could have fled inside, forcing Achilles to fight amid gates and stones, but to do so would have dishonoured him in the eyes of his people. And so he stands alone on the plain, waiting. He even runs at first, circling the walls 3 times in a desperate bid for survival. But at last he halts and faces his fate. His courage is not that of an invincible hero, but of a man embracing death because his role allows no escape. This duel, one of the most famous in literature, is less about victory and more about what each figure represents. Achilles is wrath, Hector is duty. Achilles fights for personal glory, Hector for the survival of his city and family. And though Achilles wins, it is Hector who commands our sympathy. His body dragged behind a chariot becomes not just the image of a fallen warrior, but of a civilization under siege. The nobility of Hector lies in this inevitability. He fights not because he believes he will win, but because not fighting is impossible. He fights with the knowledge that he is doomed, which makes his courage sharper, his humanity clearer. In him we see the reflection of countless defenders throughout history, those who stand at the gates, outnumbered and outmatched, because their people have no one else. For centuries audiences have read Hector not simply as a character, but as a mirror of the costs of war. His story invites us to ask, which is greater, the glory of the conqueror or the sacrifice of the defender? And if we remember Achilles for his rage, do we not also remember Hector for his calm acceptance of fate? Perhaps that is why, even when the walls of Troy crumble in the song, the memory of Hector remains unbroken. Hector's story did not end when he fell on the plain before Troy. His afterlife in poetry and memory turned him from a local prince into a universal symbol of human courage under impossible odds. Where Achilles' image travelled westward as the embodiment of heroic violence, Hector was remembered as the figure who bore the weight of inevitability with dignity. In many ways, later cultures looked at him and saw themselves, not the invincible conqueror, but the besieged, the one clinging to home and kin when empires pressed at the gates. The ancient tragedians of Athens picked up his story with particular care. In the plays of Euripides and others, Hector's absence becomes louder than any presence. His death leaves a void that characters mourn endlessly, and the lamentation of Andromache echoes through the centuries. Greek audiences, who had once imagined themselves aligned with the victorious Achaeans, often found themselves empathising more deeply with Hector's widow and child, left behind in a city doomed to be enslaved. That turn of sympathy says much about how his figure unsettled the usual balance of heroic storytelling. It is not victory that compels memory, but loss. By the time Rome rose to dominance, Hector had become a cultural touchstone. Roman poets, particularly Virgil in his Aeneid, invoked him as the tragic guardian of a dying city. When Aeneas dreams of Hector appearing to him in the night, covered in blood and dust, urging him to flee and carry Troy's destiny onward, the image is unforgettable. Hector, already dead, becomes the voice of continuity. Though he cannot save his own people, he can pass the torch to another. For the Romans, this dream was not just poetry, but a piece of their imagined ancestry, since they traced their origins to Trojan refugees. To them, Hector's death was not only a tragedy, but also the necessary prelude to their own rise. In the medieval period, his image shifted yet again. European romances, particularly in France and England, absorbed Hector into the canon of 9 worthies, figures who represented the pinnacle of knightly virtue, alongside biblical and classical heroes. Here he was remembered less as the tragic defender of a city, and more as the archetype of chivalric nobility. Knights who read or listened to these tales were not seeking lessons in inevitability, but examples of loyalty, honour and martial courage. Yet even in this transformation, the shadow of Troy lingered. His name carried with it the memory of a city that had stood against the odds. Later writers took Hector as a counterpoint to Achilles. In Renaissance drama, particularly in the works of Shakespeare, he appears again as the moral opposite of the Greek champion. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida portrays him as honourable in a world of treachery and cynicism. His death in that play is no less moving than in Homer, though coloured by Elizabethan scepticism about war and politics. For audiences of that time, Hector embodied not only valour but also the futility of holding to virtue when the world around him was collapsing into corruption. What makes Hector endure across centuries is not his victory, he had none, but his humanity. He is the warrior who pauses to smile at his infant son, the commander who bears the dread of inevitable defeat without turning away, the man who faces the greatest warrior of his age with trembling steps, and then stands still to accept his fate. Cultures across time have recognised themselves in him. Soldiers trapped in trenches, cities under siege, communities facing overwhelming force, all have looked back and found in Hector a figure who knew what it was to resist even when resistance promised nothing but death. The question remains, why do we admire him so deeply? Perhaps because his story suggests that nobility does not depend on outcomes. It resides instead in the choice to stand firm when every rational calculation says to run. Hector reminds us that glory is fleeting, but dignity is lasting. His name, echoing through poems, plays and romances, survives not because he conquered, but because he endured, and perhaps that is the greater victory, one that outlasts the fall of walls and the sweep of empires. What makes a king walk into his enemy's tent unarmed? The image is among the most haunting in the Iliad. An old man, stooped and broken by grief, slipping through the camp of the enemy at night to beg for the body of his son. This man is Priam, king of Troy, the last and greatest of the city's rulers. In a poem saturated with rage, violence and revenge, his act is one of humility and humanity. It is worth pausing to consider what it means that the Iliad, a story about war and destruction, reaches its emotional climax not with victory, but with an old man's plea for compassion. Priam is remembered not only as a king but as a father. His kingdom has been burning for years under the relentless assault of the Achaeans, yet what finally brings him to his knees is not the collapse of walls or the loss of wealth, but the sight of Hector's corpse dragged in the dust by Achilles. Priam's choice to cross into the camp of the enemy is an act at once desperate and courageous. He kneels before the man who has killed so many of his children, grasping the hands still stained with his son's blood. In Homer's telling, he does not appeal to treaties or to divine law, but to shared humanity. He reminds Achilles of his own father, aged and vulnerable, waiting far away in Phthia. By invoking the universal bond between father and son, Priam softens the heart of the man whose fury had seemed limitless. What is remarkable is that this moment does not end with vengeance, but with empathy. Achilles, who had been raging like a force of nature, weeps with Priam. He orders Hector's body to be returned, washed, and prepared for burial. For a brief time, the war halts. The funeral of Hector allows the Trojans to grieve with dignity. It is a pause before the inevitable storm that will eventually consume the city. But for Homer, it is the note of humanity that rings the loudest. The Iliad does not end with the fall of Troy, or with the wooden horse, but with Priam's successful plea and Hector's burial rites. Priam's nobility in this scene is what later generations admired most. He becomes the archetype of the suffering king, one who represents not power in its triumph, but authority in its humility. The Greeks who listened to this poem performed would have recognized the enormity of the gesture. Kings in their world did not kneel, especially not to enemies. To humble oneself in such a way was to risk total loss of honour. Yet Priam chose it because he valued his son's dignity more than his own. His act was a recognition that even in war, humanity could not be extinguished entirely. Historically, the figure of Priam raises as many questions as it answers. Was there truly a last king of Troy who bore this name? The name Priam may have roots in the languages of Anatolia, possibly connected to the Luwian or Hittite world, which lends some plausibility to his existence. In the Hittite records we encounter rulers of Wilusa, the name many scholars link to Troy, who negotiated treaties with the kings of Hatti. While none of them can be definitively identified as Priam, the echoes are tantalizing. They remind us that Homer was drawing from a deep well of oral tradition, in which memories of real rulers, distorted by centuries of storytelling, might have survived. Archaeologically, we cannot point to a throne room or burial that can be labelled with his name. The palaces of Troy's late Bronze Age layers reveal fragments of what must have been a ruling elite, but the individuals remain anonymous. Pottery shards, wall foundations, and traces of feasting give us hints of a royal court, yet the voices of its kings are lost. Priam stands at the threshold between memory and myth, perhaps based on a real king, perhaps a poetic amalgam, but certainly transformed into something greater than history could preserve. Priam's role is not only political or paternal, but symbolic. In many ways, he represents the old order of Troy itself, venerable, dignified, but unable to withstand the violent transformations of the age. His decision to walk into the enemy's camp unarmed could be read as an acknowledgement that the old ways of kingship, based on authority, wealth, and lineage, were failing. What remained was the appeal to shared humanity, a fragile but enduring bond. This is perhaps why his story has resonated for millennia. He embodies the recognition that kingship without compassion is hollow, and that even in defeat there is room for dignity. Later literature and art consistently return to this figure. The tragedians of classical Athens imagined Priam as the very embodiment of grief, his laments echoing over the smoking ruins of his city. In Roman art he appears as a venerable elder, his fall used to highlight the cruelty of conquest. Medieval retellings cast him as a tragic patriarch, a king betrayed by fate rather than defeated by skill. Across cultures, Priam's humility stood out as the moral core of the Trojan story. The haunting question lingers. What makes a king walk unarmed into the tent of his enemy? Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps courage, perhaps both. But it also speaks to something deeper. The recognition that no matter how high the walls, how sharp the spears, or how furious the warriors, human grief and compassion remain stronger than the machinery of war. That is the legacy of Priam, the last king of Troy. Not conquest, not wealth, but the reminder that even in the darkest hours of destruction, there can still be a plea for mercy, and sometimes mercy granted. The image of Priam did not remain fixed in Homer's world alone. Later storytellers added new dimensions, often making his fate even more tragic. In the Aeneid, Virgil presents Priam not as the pleading father but as the aged king who witnesses his city's final destruction. In this version, Priam arms himself in a last, desperate gesture of defiance, only to be cut down by Neoptolemus, the brutal son of Achilles. His blood stains the very altar at which he had sought protection. This literary choice underscores the totality of Troy's ruin, the king's body desecrated in the heart of his palace, the line of authority extinguished in a single stroke. While Homer had chosen to end his epic with dignity and reconciliation, Virgil wanted Roman audiences to feel the scale of devastation that Aeneas escaped. Priam becomes, in that retelling, the embodiment of a world swept away to make room for another. Artistic representations of Priam's final moments reflect this duality. On ancient vases, reliefs and sarcophagi, he is sometimes shown kneeling before Achilles, the humble supplicant. Elsewhere he appears crumpled beneath the sword of Neoptolemus, a warning to audiences about the brutality of war. These shifting images reveal how his figure could be adapted depending on what moral or emotional lesson the artist or poet sought to convey. Was he the king who restored humanity to his enemy, or the king who proved that no power could withstand the violence of fate? Perhaps he was both, depending on which version of Troy's fall one told. What makes Priam so enduring in memory is that he represents more than a character in a poem. He is the symbolic anchor of a civilization under siege. Kingship in the Bronze Age was not merely political but also spiritual, linking the city to the divine order. To see a king kneel, or to see him slain at an altar, would have carried a deeper resonance than the death of a warrior on the battlefield. It marked the undoing of the sacred bond between city, ruler, and gods. Priam's fate is, in a way, the fate of Troy itself, the collapse of authority, the end of continuity, the silencing of tradition. Even today, historians find themselves reflecting on Priam, less as a historical figure and more as a mirror. He's the image of leadership in decline, of dignity in the face of hopelessness. His presence in the Iliad reminds us that even the most famous war of antiquity was not, in the end, about heroes chasing glory alone. It was also about the ordinary human experience of loss, seen most powerfully in the grief of an old man. And perhaps that is the true reason his story continues to haunt us. Priam embodies the truth that war does not spare the old, the young, the innocent, or the noble. It swallows them all, leaving only memory and questions about what it means to be human when everything else has been stripped away. Could a wooden horse really topple a city? The story of the Trojan Horse is among the most recognisable tales in Western tradition, yet also among the most puzzling. A massive wooden statue, hollow inside, left at the gates of Troy as a gift from the retreating Greeks, only to conceal warriors who opened the gates from within. At first glance, it sounds like a fable more suited to a children's story than the end of a 10-year siege. And yet, the tale endures. It forces us to ask, was this a historical reality, a poetic metaphor, or something stranger still? The idea of hiding men in a wooden construction is not in itself impossible. Siege warfare in the Bronze Age did involve trickery, ambush, and infiltration. Cities with strong fortifications could rarely be taken by brute force alone. High stone walls, ditches, and towers gave defenders immense advantages. Attackers relied on starvation sieges, surprise assaults, or clever stratagems. From this perspective, the horse may have been less an impossibility than an allegory. Perhaps it was a poetic stand-in for some kind of ruse, whether a disguised ship, a concealed storming party, or even the catastrophic collapse of the city itself. One of the most persistent interpretations is that the horse was not literal at all, but a metaphor for an earthquake. The Greek god Poseidon, who was both lord of the sea and associated with horses, was also worshipped as the earth shaker. An earthquake that split Troy's defences might have been remembered in song as the horse of Poseidon, the force that broke the city. Over centuries of oral storytelling, a symbolic earthquake horse could have become a wooden construction in which men hid. The image was simpler, more dramatic, and more memorable for audiences. Another interpretation looks not to earthquakes but to ships. Bronze Age ships, with their curved prows and high wooden sides, were sometimes described as horses of the sea. In some ancient poetry, the metaphor is explicit. Could the horse that entered Troy have been a ship dragged inland, perhaps carrying soldiers who disembarked unexpectedly within the walls? To a later audience unfamiliar with these idioms, the metaphor might have solidified into a literal horse statue. There is also the possibility that some form of wooden siege engine inspired the tale. Battering rams, covered towers, and rolling wooden frames were already in use in the Near East long before the supposed Trojan War. A massive timber structure wheeled to the gates of Troy might well have been described in mythic shorthand as a horse, especially if adorned with carved decorations. In a world where animal imagery often carried symbolic weight, describing a war machine as a horse would not have been out of place. Still, one cannot dismiss the dramatic ingenuity of the story itself. Hiding a strike team in a large wooden effigy is not wholly beyond imagination. Ancient carpenters and shipbuilders were capable of constructing hollow structures of significant size. The logistical problem lies not in building the horse, but in convincing the Trojans to drag it inside their fortified city. Here the narrative becomes less about engineering and more about psychology. What would compel a besieged population, exhausted after years of war, to accept such a gift? Perhaps it was desperation for an omen of victory, a misinterpretation of religious ritual, or simply the fatigue of endless vigilance. The symbolism of the horse should not be overlooked. Horses in the Bronze Age were not just animals of war, but symbols of wealth, status, and divine favour. Chariots drawn by horses transformed battlefields, while myths connected them to gods and cosmic power. To present a horse as a dedication to the Trojans may have tapped into this symbolic reservoir, making the object seem more than a gift. It may have appeared as a sacred offering, a gesture too significant to ignore. The decision to bring it within the walls might have felt like acknowledging divine will, rather than falling for a trick. Archaeologically, of course, we have no remains of a wooden horse. Wood decays, especially in the humid soils of northwestern Turkey. The silence of the archaeological record leaves us in the realm of interpretation. But what we can say is that the story of the horse fits a larger pattern of how ancient peoples explain the fall of cities, not through mundane attrition, but through dramatic reversals, clever ruses, or divine intervention. The horse became the narrative key that unlocked Troy's impregnable walls in memory, whether or not it ever stood on the plain in reality. And so we are left with the question: was the Trojan horse a piece of ancient military engineering, a poetic metaphor for earthquake or ship, or simply a storyteller's flourish designed to bring an epic to its dramatic climax? We cannot know with certainty. But perhaps that is why the image has endured for over 2.5 millennia. It is at once impossible and believable, practical and mythical, literal and symbolic. The horse is less an answer than a riddle, a reminder that the most enduring legends of the past survive not because they are reasonable, but because they are unforgettable. If we follow the long afterlife of the Trojan horse, its meaning grows larger than the narrow question of whether carpenters once built such a device. Ancient writers quickly recognized that the story worked as a universal parable about deception and misplaced trust. In Greek tragedy, the horse becomes less about military cunning and more about human folly. Euripides in his Trojan Women makes the moment of its arrival a symbol of false hope. The Trojans believe they are receiving a divine gift, only to find they have welcomed their own destruction. The lesson was clear for audiences: beware gifts from enemies, and beware the seductive comfort of believing a long struggle has ended, when in truth the danger is only beginning. Later authors elaborated on this theme. Virgil, in his Aeneid, devoted an entire book to the fall of Troy and placed the horse at its centre. His telling sharpened the moral edge of the story. The Trojans are divided. Some warn against bringing the horse inside, others insist it must be honoured. A Greek named Sinon, pretending to be a deserter, manipulates them with a tale of sacrifice and divine command. To Virgil's Roman readers, the message was not simply about gullibility, but about the fragility of judgment under duress. In wartime, the line between prudence and folly can be thin, and the horse embodied that dangerous ambiguity. Archaeologists, of course, approach the tale from a different angle. For them, the question is not moral but practical. Could such a ruse be plausible in the context of late Bronze Age warfare? While they cannot confirm a literal horse, they point to the broader phenomenon of stratagems. Ancient texts from the Hittites, Egyptians, and Assyrians all describe cities captured through cunning as much as force. The Greeks themselves were fascinated by tales of trickery and war. Odysseus, the so-called man of many wiles, stands as proof that guile was celebrated alongside brute strength. The horse may then represent the most famous example of a cultural pattern, where victory belonged to the clever as much as to the strong. The symbolism did not fade after antiquity. During the Renaissance, the Trojan horse re-emerged as a favourite motif in art and politics. Painters filled canvases with scenes of the gigantic wooden beast being hauled into the city. Statesmen used the story as a metaphor for infiltration, warning against enemies disguised as allies. Even today, the phrase Trojan Horse endures as shorthand for hidden threats, from computer viruses to political manoeuvres. The endurance of the phrase suggests that whether or not the event occurred as described, the lesson it carries still resonates. So the horse stands at a crossroads of history and imagination. It may never have rolled across the plain before Troy, yet it has travelled further than any war machine could. Perhaps that is the most telling point. The power of the Trojan horse lies not in its timber, but in its story, one that continues to remind us that sometimes the most devastating blows are the ones we invite inside ourselves. Can ash prove Homer? For decades, archaeologists at Hisarlik have scraped through layers of soil in search of evidence that might bridge the gulf between myth and material fact. What they uncovered in one layer was dramatic. A city scarred by flames, its walls blackened, its remains laced with weapons and bones. Radiocarbon dates placed the destruction around 1250 years before the Common Era, exactly the period later associated with the collapse of Bronze Age kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. The discovery was striking not just for its scale, but for its timing. Could this be the very catastrophe that gave rise to the legend of Troy's fall? Excavators described a layer of charcoal that ran across the site, thicker in some places than in others, but unmistakably the residue of a fire that had consumed more than just houses. Fortification walls bore marks of intense heat, with stones cracked from sudden temperature change. Fragments of pottery fused into hardened clumps told the same story. This was no minor incident, no hearth fire that got out of control. It was a citywide inferno, one violent enough to leave its imprint in the soil for over 3,000 years. Alongside the ash came another kind of evidence: weapons. Bronze arrowheads and spear points were discovered lodged in walls, scattered across floors and embedded in debris. Their distribution suggested not a peaceful abandonment, but fighting. A battle waged within the city itself. Horses were found too, their bones lying where they had fallen, some near human skeletons. The combination of fire, weapons, and bodies painted a vivid picture, one that echoed, though could not confirm, the descriptions in Homer's poetry of a city besieged and destroyed. The temptation to draw a direct line between ash and epic is strong. The Iliad, though composed centuries later, describes Troy in flames, its defenders cut down, its houses collapsing in ruin. The archaeological evidence offers an uncanny parallel, and yet, caution is necessary. Fires were not unusual in ancient cities. Timber roofs, open flames, and dense settlements meant that accidental blazes could devastate entire neighbourhoods. Nor can we always distinguish between destruction by human hands and the collateral damage of natural disaster. What makes the 1250 layer stand out is not only the fire, but the presence of weaponry and bodies, signs that conflict may have been at its root. The radiocarbon dates add to the intrigue. Samples of charcoal and burned seeds from this destruction layer consistently return dates around the mid-13th century before the Common Era. This coincides with a period of upheaval across the Aegean and Anatolia, when palaces fell and trade networks fractured. That Troy, or Wilusa, as it may have been known, should suffer destruction in this era is not surprising. What is striking is that the date aligns with the later tradition of a great war fought at Troy. Oral memory may well have preserved a kernel of truth, even if details were reshaped in centuries of retelling. The bones, too, whisper fragments of a story. Some skeletons bear marks of violent death, sharp cuts to bone consistent with sword or spear. Others were found haphazardly, suggesting they were not laid to rest with ceremony, but left amid the wreckage. For archaeologists, these are not merely bones, but echoes of lives caught in catastrophe. They do not tell us of Achilles or Hector, of kings or horses, but they do remind us that real people suffered and died here. In that sense, they anchor the myth to the ground, showing that behind the poetry there was flesh and blood. And yet, the evidence is not conclusive. Could this destruction have been the work of marauders unrelated to Homer's Greeks? Could it have been part of the broader wave of turmoil that ended the Bronze Age, in which countless cities burned and were abandoned? Was this Troy's final fall, or only one of several calamities across centuries? Archaeology offers us a scene but not a script. The fire and the weapons are undeniable, but what they meant to those who lived through them is forever beyond our reach. Perhaps that is what makes this layer so compelling. It does not prove Homer's story, but it refuses to let us dismiss it entirely as fiction. Somewhere in the ashes of 1250 lies the trace of a disaster remembered for centuries. Whether sung by poets or etched in the soil, it testifies to a truth as old as human history. Cities rise, cities burn, and memory turns ruins into legend. The haunting question remains: how much of Homer is myth and how much is ash? Did the Hittites, the great empire builders of central Anatolia, leave us a clue about Troy? In the 13th century, before the Common Era, their scribes recorded treaties, letters, and inventories with a diligence that has proven invaluable to historians. Preserved on clay tablets in cuneiform script, these texts offer a rare glimpse into the politics of the Late Bronze Age. Among the names of kings and cities, alliances and disputes, one name appears with striking familiarity: Wilusa. Scholars have long debated whether this Wilusa corresponds to the Ilios of Homer, the city later remembered as Troy. The parallels are tantalizing but not conclusive. The Hittite capital at Hattusar in central Anatolia held an archive of tens of thousands of tablets. When German archaeologists began excavating the site in the early 20th century, they uncovered diplomatic correspondence between Hittite kings and their peers in Egypt, Assyria, and the Aegean. Within these documents are references to a place called Wilusa, positioned in the northwest of Anatolia, precisely where Hisarlik sits. The linguistic similarity between Wilusa and Ilios is difficult to ignore. Greek speakers later dropped the W sound in many words, and so Wilios may have become Ilios over time. If this identification is correct, then the city we call Troy was not just a poetic memory, but a real participant in the great power struggles of the age. One particularly revealing text is a treaty from around 1280, before the Common Era, between the Hittite king Muwatalli and a local ruler named Alexandru of Wilusa. The resemblance of that name to the Greek Alexandros, another name for Paris in Homer's tale, has drawn much speculation. Of course, Alexandru could simply have been a local Anatolian name that shared roots with the Indo-European languages spreading across the region. But the coincidence has fueled the idea that memories of real rulers lingered in oral traditions long after their actual deeds were forgotten. What matters more for archaeologists is that the treaty confirms Wilusa was a significant polity, worth the Hittites' time to bind into alliance. The treaty is especially intriguing for its invocation of divine witnesses. Among the gods listed is one cryptic phrase: the divine earth rode. Scholars interpret this as a reference to an underground stream or passage considered sacred. At Hisarlik, archaeologists have indeed uncovered a network of man-made channels leading to subterranean water sources dating back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era and maintained into the Late Bronze Age. The match is striking. It suggests that the Hittites were not writing in abstractions, but referring to physical features of a real city, features that can still be traced today beneath the mound. The convergence of text and archaeology strengthens the case that Wilusa was Troy. Other letters hint at conflict involving Wilusa. A fragmentary text known as the Tawagalawa letter, written by a Hittite king to a Western ruler, possibly a Mycenaean, complains of trouble in Wilusa and urges peaceful resolution. While details are scarce, it demonstrates that Wilusa lay on the frontier between the Hittites and the Aegean powers, a fault line where disputes could flare into war. This geopolitical context makes the idea of a great conflict at Troy less implausible. Even if Homer's 10-year siege is poetic exaggeration, there were certainly tensions and possibly battles in this contested region. Still, the Hittite texts are not without ambiguity. The cuneiform signs are difficult, the tablets often broken, and the geography imprecise. While the identification of Wilusa with Troy is widely accepted today, it is not unanimous. Some scholars argue that Wilusa may have lain further inland, or that the similarity in names is coincidental. The evidence is strong enough to be persuasive but not definitive. That tension between possibility and uncertainty is what makes the study of these texts so captivating. The real challenge is bridging two worlds, the sober administrative prose of the Hittite tablets and the lyrical verses of Greek epic. The Hittites wrote of treaties, borders, and divine witnesses. Homer sang of heroes, rage, and gods striding across the battlefield. The temptation to fuse them into a single story is powerful, but we must tread carefully. The letters show us that Wilusa was real, politically significant, and known to its powerful neighbours. They do not show us a wooden horse or a quarrel over Helen. Yet, by providing names, dates, and locations, they remind us that the poetry of the Iliad did not spring from nothing. It grew in a landscape where cities like Wilusa stood at the crossroads of empires, vulnerable to both diplomacy and destruction. The haunting question is whether the men who swore oaths in the Treaty of Muwatalli, invoking the divine earth road of Wilusa, could ever have imagined that centuries later their city would be remembered not for its politics but for a war of legend. Was Troy already famous in their own time, or did the myth only take shape long after the fires had died and the treaties had crumbled? We can read their words, we can walk their ruins, but we cannot know what they believed their city meant to the world. That silence between text and memory is what keeps Troy suspended between history and myth. Who were the people who actually lived in Troy? It is a deceptively simple question, but it quickly dissolves into debates about identity, language, and culture in a part of the world where lines between tribes and nations were never clean. Homer calls them Trojans, their enemies called them barbarians, and archaeologists call them inhabitants of Hisarlik. But when we sift through the evidence, what emerges is a society that does not fit neatly into the category of Greek, nor entirely foreign, but something distinctly Anatolian, with its own roots and connections to multiple worlds. One prominent theory sees the Trojans as part of the Luwian-speaking communities of Western Anatolia. Luwian was closely related to Hittite, both belonging to the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European family. Inscriptions found in central and southern Turkey confirm the widespread use of this language in the second millennium before the Common Era. If Wilusa is indeed Troy, then its rulers likely used Luwian or a closely related tongue in their treaties and administration. That would make the Trojans more Anatolian than Greek, culturally closer to their Hittite neighbours than to the Mycenaean palaces across the Aegean. Yet contact across the sea was constant, and no people in this region were isolated. Imported pottery from Greece appears in Troy, and Western goods reached Anatolian hands. Language may have separated them, but trade tied them together. Another theory looks further west. Some scholars have suggested that the Trojans may have been linked to the Thracians, the people who lived north of the Aegean in what is now Bulgaria and the Balkans. Ancient sources occasionally blurred the lines between Thracians and Trojans, describing them as kin or allies. Archaeological parallels in burial customs and weaponry between Thracian and northwestern Anatolian sites add weight to the idea. If true, it would mean that Troy was less an Anatolian outpost and more a bridgehead for Balkan peoples moving into Asia Minor. The Thracian hypothesis reminds us that the sea was not a barrier but a highway, and the Dardanelles Strait was a gate that linked rather than divided. The truth is probably more complex. Troy lay on the edge of multiple cultural zones, and its population may have been mixed. DNA studies of ancient remains from Anatolia show a mosaic of ancestries, with local farmers blending with incoming groups from the Eurasian steppe during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. By the time of the Late Bronze Age, Hisarlik's people could have carried genetic and cultural elements from both Anatolia and Europe. The artefacts they left behind, from pottery styles to architectural features, reflect this hybridity. Troy was neither purely Eastern nor purely Western, but something in between. This raises another point. The Trojans themselves probably did not think in our categories of identity. They did not call themselves Indo-Europeans, Thracians, or Greeks. They had local traditions, family lineages, and political allegiances that mattered more than language trees drawn thousands of years later. What mattered in their world was loyalty to rulers, participation in trade networks, and survival in a region often caught between larger powers. When Homer later sang of Trojans and Greeks, he was imposing his own binary upon a world that was far more entangled. Archaeology helps us glimpse their daily lives. Houses at Troy 6, the level many associate with the city of the Iliad, were built of stone foundations with mud brick walls, organised along narrow streets. Storage jars suggest they kept grain in bulk, while evidence of imported tin and copper implies that metalworking was a significant craft. The presence of horse bones at the site hints at a society familiar with riding and chariot warfare, skills spreading across the Near East at the time. They were seafarers too, for the city's location made little sense without access to maritime trade. Their ships may have looked like the sleek vessels depicted in contemporary Aegean art, carrying goods along the coastlines and across the straits. Yet identity is more than economy or architecture. The Trojans left no texts of their own, so we cannot hear their voice directly. Were they singing in Luwian, or another Anatolian dialect, or something lost altogether? Did they see themselves as subjects of the Hittite Empire, or as independent rulers of a proud city? Did they view the Greeks as neighbours, rivals, or occasional trading partners? The answers escape us, but the questions remind us that Troy was not a blank canvas onto which Greeks projected their stories. It was a living society with its own sense of self, one we can only reconstruct in fragments. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Trojan identity debate is how quickly their real voice was drowned out by myth. Once Homer's epics took hold, Trojan became a poetic category rather than an anthropological one. For later Greeks and Romans, it meant noble enemies or ancestral founders, depending on the story one wanted to tell. For us, it has become shorthand for a war that may or may not have happened. But beneath that mythic overlay was a population of real people, speaking a language not Greek, farming and sailing, trading and fighting, and ultimately vanishing into history. The lingering question is whether we will ever pin down precisely who they were. The soil of Hisarlik has yielded gold, weapons, bones, and walls, but not the names the Trojans gave themselves. Perhaps that is fitting. For a city that lives half in history and half in legend, its people remain just out of reach, shadows caught between cultures, never fully belonging to one or the other. What happens when myth and science disagree? Few places bring that tension into sharper focus than the windswept mound of Hisarlik. On the one hand, there is Homer, whose verses still echo with the clash of bronze and the grief of gods. On the other hand, there is archaeology, with its trenches, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon dates, which insist on their own slower, earthbound truths. The Iliad and the Odyssey conjure a world of heroes, 10-year sieges, and divine interventions. The soil beneath northwest Turkey presents burned layers, pottery shards, and foundations that do not always match the poet's scale. Between the two lies the challenge of interpretation, to ask not whether Homer was right or wrong, but how memory, imagination, and reality became entangled in the first place. The first clash emerges with chronology. Homer's epic, set around the supposed 12th century before the Common Era, describes a city under siege during the Late Bronze Age. Archaeology has indeed uncovered evidence of a substantial city around that time, known as Troy 6 and 7 in modern classification. Their stone walls and towers suggest a stronghold worthy of a story. Yet the same archaeology shows at least 9 major layers of settlement spanning thousands of years, each one different in size, wealth, and cultural connections. Which of these Troys, if any, was Homer's city? Was the poet recalling a specific destruction, or weaving together memories of multiple collapses, perhaps separated by centuries? Archaeology cannot give a definitive answer, but it forces us to admit that the Iliad may telescope many pasts into one dramatic tale. Scale presents another conflict. Homer depicts Troy as a vast metropolis, a match for the combined might of dozens of Greek kingdoms. For centuries, critics pointed to Hisarlik's modest mound and doubted it could ever have held such grandeur. Excavations by Manfred Kaufmann and his team at the turn of the 21st century shifted the picture by revealing a lower city far larger than Schliemann ever imagined. Magnetometry surveys uncovered ditches and fortifications enclosing an area that might have housed thousands of inhabitants. Still, the city was no Babylon or Thebes. Compared to other centres of the Late Bronze Age, Troy was respectable but not unmatched. Homer's scale may have been poetic inflation, not archaeological reality. The city was impressive, but whether it could have withstood 10-year siege by a pan-Hellenic coalition remains debatable. The nature of warfare also draws a line between myth and excavation. Homer sings of chariots racing before the walls, of hand-to-hand duels between champions, and of rivers running with blood. Archaeology provides arrowheads lodged in stones, bones with trauma, and a layer of ash dated to roughly 1250 before the Common Era. This destruction aligns tantalizingly with the time frame suggested for the Trojan War, yet it tells a different kind of story. Rather than a decade-long epic, the evidence might reflect a brief violent attack, or even a fire caused by earthquake and conflict combined. The Iliad may be exaggeration, not fabrication, a real crisis remembered, but reshaped into a tale of gods and heroes. Even the landscape resists a perfect match. Homer describes Troy as a wealthy port, its ships moored close to the walls. Today, Hisarlik stands several kilometres inland, surrounded by farmland. Geological studies, however, show that the shoreline was once much closer, a lagoon stretching beneath the hill during the Bronze Age. This brings Homer closer to credibility, but it also reminds us that landscapes shift faster than legends. For the Greeks of the 8th century before the Common Era, the poet's vision of a coastal city may have already been a nostalgic reconstruction. The Iliad could be accurate in spirit while still inaccurate in detail. Then there is the problem of silence. Archaeology can reveal buildings, fire and artifacts, but it cannot give us names. We cannot say with certainty whether Priam ruled, whether Hector defended, or whether Achilles' rage ever scorched the plains of Ilios. Excavation uncovers anonymous warriors, their weapons rusted, their identities lost. Homer, by contrast, insists on names, lineages, and speeches that breathe life into each figure. The contrast is poignant. The poet immortalizes what archaeology anonymizes. Both are incomplete. Together they remind us that neither story is fully the truth. Modern scholarship has sometimes fallen into extremes. Some argue that the Iliad is pure invention, a heroic fantasy layered upon an ordinary city. Others argue that archaeology now proves the historicity of the Trojan War. Both positions oversimplify. Myth and excavation do not cancel each other. They illuminate different truths. Homer gives us a memory of meaning, of why wars happen and why grief endures. Archaeology gives us the material traces of lived experience. The trick is to let them speak to each other without demanding perfect agreement. The deeper question becomes, why do we want them to match at all? Is it because we crave certainty? Because we wish to know that the stories passed down for 3,000 years were not in vain? Or is it because myth and science, in their different ways, offer us comfort? The poet by giving names to loss, the archaeologist by grounding us in the earth? Perhaps the real conflict is not between Homer and excavation, but between our own need for narrative and the fragmentary nature of the past. The mound of Hisarlik will never sing like Homer, and the Iliad will never submit to radiocarbon dates. Yet in the space between them, something powerful emerges. Myth tells us why people fought and died. Archaeology tells us that they did, and perhaps that is enough. What happens after destruction? The walls of Troy had witnessed flames, collapsing towers, and the bodies of the fallen, but history does not end with catastrophe. The soil of Hisarlik reveals that life continued after the Great Burning Layer dated to around 1250 before the Common Era. What followed is known today as Troy 7, a city that endured even as the wider Bronze Age world fractured into chaos. To understand this quieter, less celebrated phase is to appreciate the resilience of ordinary people who rebuilt amid the ruins, refusing to let their hilltop home vanish into memory. Archaeology makes the distinction clear. Troy 6, with its impressive stone fortifications and expansive lower town, seems to have been a city of wealth and ambition, linked to long-distance trade. The fire that destroyed it left layers of ash and signs of sudden violence. When settlers returned, they did not abandon the mound. Instead, they repaired walls and reoccupied houses, though the scale and quality of construction were diminished. Buildings of Troy 7 were often smaller, hastily erected, and more cramped. Large storage jars buried into floors suggest a community that lived with uncertainty, hoarding food in preparation for siege or scarcity. The grandeur of Cyclopean masonry was gone, replaced by more utilitarian concerns of survival. This shift reflects a broader pattern across the eastern Mediterranean during the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse. Between the 13th and 11th centuries before the Common Era, cities from Mycenae to Ugarit fell, palaces burned, and writing systems disappeared. Trade networks that had linked Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant and the Aegean disintegrated. Scholars still debate the causes: climate shifts, earthquakes, invasions by the so-called sea peoples, or internal revolts. Likely it was a convergence of multiple stresses that toppled the interconnected system. Troy was not spared, but it was also not erased. Instead, its population adjusted downward, carving out a humbler existence in a new age of fragmentation. The archaeological remains of Troy 7 tell a story not of opulence but of resilience. Pottery becomes simpler, less decorated, reflecting a society with fewer resources for luxury. Imported goods decline sharply, suggesting that long-distance exchange routes were severed or too dangerous to maintain. Yet local crafts persisted, and people continued to adapt. The persistence of settlement itself is striking. Even when much of the Aegean descended into dark centuries, Hisarlik was not completely abandoned. Perhaps the strategic location near the Dardanelles made it too valuable to desert. Even a diminished Troy could control or monitor movement through this narrow waterway, a factor that may have ensured its survival when other centres were lost. Life for the inhabitants of Troy 7 would have been harsh. Houses were packed tightly together, with narrow passageways running between them. The large pithoi sunk into the floors indicate that families feared sudden shortages or sieges. This sense of insecurity was not unique to Troy. Across the Mediterranean, fortifications became more common during this period, reflecting a world where raiding and piracy were widespread. Communities shrank and became more defensive, prioritising security over monumentality. Troy 7 fits neatly into this wider landscape of a world in retreat from its earlier cosmopolitan heights. One haunting element of Troy 7 is the human remains discovered in hurriedly dug pits within the settlement itself. Archaeologists uncovered skeletons that seem to have been buried without ceremony, perhaps victims of conflict or plague. These burials reinforce the impression of a society under duress, coping with trauma while lacking the time or means for proper rituals. The image is far removed from heroic poetry, yet it tells us more about how real people endured catastrophe. Survival here was not glorious, but pragmatic. Families stored grain, patched walls, and buried their dead as best they could. Still, even amid decline, Troy 7 was not devoid of connection. Local pottery traditions show continuity, and traces of contact with neighbouring regions, though reduced, never vanished entirely. It is possible that the city maintained small-scale trade with coastal Anatolia or nearby islands. Horses continued to be part of the community, as bones attest, and this suggests that even in reduced circumstances, Troy remained linked to the martial traditions of the Late Bronze Age. By the 11th century before the Common Era, Troy 7 too fell into decline. Whether it succumbed to renewed violence, economic exhaustion, or gradual depopulation remains uncertain. What we know is that the once proud mound entered a quieter phase, its role in international affairs diminished, its memory fading even as new cultures rose around it. But the fact that people rebuilt at all, and endured for centuries after destruction, should temper the image of a city reduced to ashes. Troy was more than the backdrop of one cataclysmic war. It was a community that persisted through cycles of disaster and renewal, a reminder that history often belongs less to the conquerors than to the survivors who carried on afterward. The haunting question remains: when myths remember only the flames, do we forget the people who lived in the ashes? Archaeologists studying Troy 7 often remark that its character feels more domestic than monumental, as though the city had shifted from being a proud gateway of international commerce to something closer to a fortified village. This shift becomes particularly clear in the way space was used. In earlier phases, wide avenues and open courtyards gave a sense of planning and display. In Troy 7, however, the spaces between houses narrowed, and many structures were built directly against the fortification walls. It suggests not only population pressure, but also a desire for protection, as if every family wanted to live under the literal shadow of the defences. Daily life must have felt crowded, noisy, and tense, yet still functional enough for a community to survive for centuries. Evidence of diet adds more texture to the story of this later Troy. Faunal remains show that cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs remained staples, but there is also an increase in evidence of fishing and shellfish collection. Some scholars have argued that this reflects a shift in subsistence strategy, With people turning more to local waters as overland trade became less reliable, combined with the storage jars sunk into household floors, it points to a community that was both adaptive and cautious, constantly guarding against the possibility of scarcity. The broader context of the Aegean collapse helps us place these choices in perspective. While palaces in Greece were abandoned and writing systems like Linear B disappeared, Troy persisted. It may not have had scribes producing clay tablets to record taxes or inventories, but its community endured in simpler ways, through oral traditions, through practical skills in farming and building, through family ties that bound people to their land. Continuity in itself is a kind of success in such a turbulent age. One striking discovery from Troy 7 is the presence of small industrial installations, including hearths and work areas used for metalworking. Despite reduced access to imported tin, bronze was still being produced, albeit on a more limited scale. This indicates that even during hardship, Troy's inhabitants preserved specialised skills that linked them to the technological traditions of the Bronze Age. The resilience of craft traditions helps explain how communities like Troy could bridge the gap between the grand networks of the second millennium and the emerging cultures of the first. When we look at Troy 7, we see not the glamorous city of legend, but something more human, a community scaling back its ambitions yet refusing to disappear. Its people planted crops, raised children, and hammered bronze even as the wider world fell into disarray. They may not have recognised themselves in the songs of distant bards, but their persistence ensured that Hisarlik remained inhabited when so many other centres were reduced to silence. In the long rhythm of history, that endurance is no less remarkable than any tale of conquest. Why could the Greeks never let go of Troy? The city burned, its towers toppled, and its people scattered, yet centuries later its memory refused to fade. By the 8th century before the Common Era, long after the Bronze Age palaces had collapsed, and new forms of life had emerged across the Aegean, bards were still singing of Troy. In fact, they were singing more than ever. The story had grown into the Iliad and the Odyssey, vast epics woven from countless older threads. The Greeks of this later age were different people from those who may once have fought on the Trojan plain, but they made Troy their own, shaping its memory into the foundation of their collective identity. The survival of this memory depended on the power of oral tradition. Before the Greeks rediscovered writing in the early first millennium before the Common Era, their culture relied on performance. Stories were recited, sung, and reshaped in the gatherings of villages and the festivals of cities. Skilled aoidoi, or singers, passed the tales down, improvising details while preserving the essential core. This meant that memories of Troy were never fixed but always alive, adapting to the audience and the times. Some verses may have been sung for hundreds of years before Homer, whoever he was, gave them the shape we now know. In this way, Troy became less a historical place, and more a cultural reservoir, a story that survived because it mattered too much to lose. Why Troy, and not some other war? One answer lies in scale. Even if the real conflict was smaller than the poems suggest, the idea of a coalition of Greek-speaking kingdoms uniting against a formidable enemy was powerful. For the city-states of the archaic period, still finding their place in a fractured landscape, Troy offered an imagined moment of unity. It was a myth of origin that suggested that Greeks, when pressed, could act as one. In this sense, Troy was not just about the past, but about the present needs of identity and solidarity. Another answer lies in religion. By the 8th century, the Greeks had begun to venerate the heroes of the Trojan cycle as more than just characters in a story. Shrines were erected where Achilles was believed to be buried, offerings were left at supposed tombs of Ajax, and cults of Hector appeared in distant places. These hero cults blurred the line between myth and worship. To honour the heroes of Troy was to acknowledge their lingering presence in the world, and in doing so the Greeks made the war part of their sacred landscape. Troy was not just remembered, it was ritualised. The poems themselves deepened this memory. The Iliad is not only a tale of war, but also a meditation on rage, mortality, and the cost of glory. The Odyssey explores the long aftermath, the wandering, and the longing for home. These themes were universal, and audiences found themselves reflected in them. farmers, sailors, and aristocrats alike could see their struggles mirrored in the fates of Odysseus or Achilles. By embedding human experience into the tale of Troy, Homer ensured its permanence in the Greek mind. Archaeology hints at another factor. The Greeks may have seen Troy as a real place they could visit. Already in antiquity, travellers to northwestern Anatolia believed they could identify the site of Ilios. Pilgrimages were made to the ruins, where guides would point out the remnants of walls or tombs. Whether the identifications were accurate mattered less than the conviction that the place of Troy still existed. The ruins lent the story a physical anchor, making the memory tangible and harder to dismiss. Troy also served as a mirror for the Greeks' own conflicts. During the 8th century, city-states were frequently at war, raiding one another's lands and competing for dominance. The Trojan War provided a model, both a warning and an inspiration. It showed the costs of disunity, but also the glory of shared struggle. For poets and audiences alike, it became a canvas on which to project anxieties about their own fractured world. The persistence of Troy's memory reminds us that history is not just about what happened, but about what people choose to remember. Even if the war was exaggerated or even invented, the Greeks believed it had shaped them. That belief alone was enough to give the story power. Troy endured because it became part of the Greek answer to the question of who they were. Yet the haunting question lingers. Did the Greeks keep Troy alive to honour their ancestors, or because they needed an enemy forever preserved in fire? The memory of Troy also endured because it functioned as a shared stage for performance. By the 8th century before the Common Era, Pan-Hellenic festivals were beginning to knit the scattered Greek world together. At gatherings such as those at Delphi or Olympia, audiences drawn from many city-states heard versions of epic song that celebrated a common heroic past. In such spaces, the Trojan cycle became more than local folklore. It transformed into a cultural glue. A farmer from Boeotia and a sailor from Chios might disagree about politics or dialect, but they could both recognise the names Achilles, Hector and Helen. By repeating these stories at festivals, the Greeks cultivated a sense of belonging to a larger tradition. The physical performance of epic also mattered. Scholars believe the poems were sung or chanted to the accompaniment of a lyre, a performance style that made them memorable even without writing. The rhythm of dactylic hexameter, repetitive yet flexible, allowed lines to be recalled and reshaped as needed. In this way, the war at Troy was less a fixed event and more a living song, able to shift with the times. When audiences gasped at the image of fire consuming the walls, they were not listening to dry history. They were immersed in a reenactment of shared memory. That performative aspect ensured that Troy lived not on the page, but in the breath of singers and the ears of listeners. Another reason Troy stayed vivid is that it provided a kind of moral textbook. Greek communities used the characters of the war to debate questions of honour, loyalty and fate. Was Achilles right to withdraw from battle in anger? Was Hector admirable for fighting to the end, or reckless for ignoring his wife's pleas? These stories became tools for reflection, teaching lessons about courage and folly without requiring agreement on a single answer. The flexibility of interpretation made them endlessly usable. Troy endured not because it was one story, but because it could be many stories, reshaped for the needs of each generation. Archaeological traces from this period show how material culture echoed these memories. Pottery from the 8th century often depicts scenes that can be linked to Homeric episodes. Warriors boarding ships, chariots in battle, funerary games. These images suggest that the memory of Troy was not confined to song, but infused daily life, appearing on the cups people drank from and the vessels they carried to graves. Through these images, the war at Troy seeped into the ordinary rhythms of existence, making it harder still to forget. In the end, the persistence of Troy's memory was not accidental. It was nurtured by performance, ritual, politics, and art, until it became part of the DNA of Greek identity. Even in times of disunity, the Greeks carried with them the memory of a war that, whether real or not, had become the anchor of their collective imagination. And perhaps that is why Troy could never fade. Forgetting it would have meant forgetting themselves. Why did Alexander the Great, the young king of Macedon, poised to conquer the Persian Empire, pause his march in the year 334 before the Common Era to lay a wreath upon what was said to be the tomb of Achilles. The question is not trivial. At that moment, Alexander was not merely a general on the march, but a man consciously weaving himself into a tapestry of myth that stretched back centuries. His visit to the Troad, the land of ancient Troy, was as deliberate as any manoeuvre on the battlefield. It tells us that for the Greeks of his time, Troy was not a ruined city on a distant plain, but a living story that could shape identity, politics, and destiny. When Alexander set foot on the Troad, he was on the cusp of launching his audacious campaign into Asia, a campaign that would end with his army standing at the banks of the Indus. Before marching eastward, he first turned aside to the windswept plain where Homer had placed the clash of Greeks and Trojans. There, near the ancient mounds that local tradition still associated with the heroes of the Iliad, he sought not strategy, but inspiration. The sources tell us that he visited the supposed tomb of Achilles, laid a garland upon it, and ran a race naked in honour of the hero, imitating the contest described in Homer's poem. For Alexander, this was not theatre for others. It was a declaration to himself and to his companions that he was entering into a struggle on par with the legendary war of Troy. Achilles was more than a literary figure to the Greeks of the 4th century before the Common Era. He was the model of martial excellence, the embodiment of speed, strength, and glory won in battle. But he was also a reminder of mortality, a hero who achieved immortality in song precisely because he died young on the battlefield. For Alexander, who had been educated by Aristotle and raised on Homeric ideals, this combination of glory and mortality was irresistible. To lay a wreath at Achilles' grave was to signal his aspiration to walk the same path, to seek undying fame, even at the cost of his life. The act also bound Alexander to a line of continuity stretching from the Bronze Age to his own time. The Persian kings he sought to overthrow had themselves claimed dominion over Anatolia, including the land once thought of as Troy. By honouring Achilles, Alexander cast himself as the avenger of old Greek victories, the heir to those who had once sailed across the Aegean to besiege the city. The symbolism was clear to his soldiers as well. They were not merely embarking on a dangerous campaign in Asia. They were reenacting the great adventure of their ancestors, with Alexander at their head as a new Achilles. Yet we must acknowledge the uncertainties. Did the mound Alexander visited truly contain the bones of a Bronze Age warrior? Almost certainly not. Archaeology suggests that the so-called tombs were later constructions, shaped by Greek and then Macedonian imagination. What Alexander honoured was not a historical skeleton, but a cultural memory, and perhaps that was the point. Achilles' true resting place was never in the earth, but in the living tradition of Homer's song carried by voice and memory across the centuries. This visit reveals the remarkable persistence of Troy's legacy. Even though the actual city had long since fallen into ruin, its story retained the power to shape the ambitions of emperors. Alexander's gesture shows us how myth could become a political tool. To honour Achilles was to claim kinship with the greatest of warriors, but it was also to remind both allies and rivals that Alexander's campaign was framed not as a mere war of conquest, but as a continuation of a heroic struggle written into the identity of the Greeks themselves. And so, standing on the windswept plain, Alexander bent over a mound of earth, performed a ritual act, and in doing so blurred the lines between history and legend. He was not just paying respect to a hero, he was recruiting that hero into his own story. The haunting question remains, was this homage an act of sincere devotion, or was it a calculated performance designed to cast Alexander as Achilles reborn? Perhaps it was both. What matters is that the story of Troy, centuries after the supposed war, was still alive enough to guide the hands of kings and alter the course of empires. Why did the Romans, those masters of law, engineering and empire, insist that their origins lay not in Italy, but across the sea, in a city their Greek neighbours remembered as ashes and poetry? By the 1st century before the Common Era, Rome had expanded far beyond a local power. It ruled over much of the Mediterranean, and in the process it needed a story worthy of such greatness. The tale it chose was not an obscure local myth, but the enduring shadow of Troy. Rome, in its own telling, was not just a city born from shepherds and farmers by the Tiber. It was the daughter of a fallen city, a phoenix rising from the embers of Ilios. The keystone of this narrative was the figure of Aeneas. In Greek legend, Aeneas was a cousin of Hector, a prince of Troy who fought bravely but survived the war. Unlike Achilles or Priam, his story did not end with fire and ruin. Instead, he was said to have fled the destruction, carrying his aged father Anchises on his shoulders and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. The Greeks themselves sometimes mentioned this tale, but it was the Romans who seized upon it, elevating Aeneas from a footnote into a founding father. To them he was not a fugitive, but a chosen survivor, guided by the gods to carry the Trojan spirit westward, across the seas to Italy. By the late Republic, this story had become a potent political tool. The family of Julius Caesar, the Iulioi, claimed descent from Aeneas's son Ascanius, also called Iulus. To trace one's lineage back to Troy was to link oneself to a past more ancient than that of any rival family. It was also a subtle way of claiming kinship with both the Greeks and the wider Mediterranean world, while still asserting a unique identity. Caesar, who famously wept when reading of Alexander's exploits, was not above borrowing heroic ancestry to burnish his own authority. It was under Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir and the first emperor of Rome, that the Trojan connection reached its full flowering. In the years after the bloody civil wars, Augustus needed a unifying myth to knit the fractured republic into a new empire. For this, he turned to the poet Virgil. Commissioned to write a national epic, Virgil produced the Aeneid, a work that rivaled Homer in scale and ambition. In its verses, the wanderings of Aeneas became not just the story of one man, but the destiny of a people. The gods decree that Aeneas will found the line that leads to Rome. His struggles, sacrifices, and eventual victory over the Latins are framed as the necessary prelude to Rome's greatness. The Aeneid is as much propaganda as poetry. Its descriptions of Aeneas' piety, his sense of duty, and his submission to fate echo the ideals Augustus wished to project for his new regime. By placing Rome's foundation in the Trojan War, Virgil gave Augustus a double gift: continuity with the heroic past of Greece, and a myth that cast Rome as the rightful heir of a city destroyed unjustly. Where the Greeks had burned Troy, the Romans claimed to rebuild it in spirit, transposed from Anatolia to the Italian plain. Yet, we should be cautious. Archaeology does not confirm the voyage of Aeneas, nor does it link Rome's earlier settlements to refugees from Anatolia. The origins of Rome are much more prosaic, a gradual growth of Latin, Sabine and Etruscan peoples along the Tiber. The Trojan myth was not history, but aspiration. A mirror held up to reflect how the Romans wished to see themselves, and in that sense it worked brilliantly. By claiming descent from Troy, Rome tied its destiny to the great cycle of Mediterranean myth, placing itself in dialogue with Homer and asserting its place at the centre of human story. The haunting question is why this mattered so deeply to them. Perhaps it was because Troy represented resilience, the ability to survive catastrophe and transform ruin into renewal. For a people who endured invasions, wars and civil strife, the story of a survivor carrying his father through flames was deeply resonant. In adopting Aeneas as their ancestor, the Romans were not only reaching for glory but also telling themselves that endurance, not conquest alone, was at the heart of their identity. And so, in marble forums and triumphal parades, in coins stamped with Trojan symbols and in poetry recited at imperial banquets, Troy lived again, this time as Rome's mother city. The Roman embrace of Troy also reshaped the physical landscape of the city itself. By the 1st century before the Common Era, travellers from Italy and Greece arrived at the windswept hill of Hisarlik with the Aeneid fresh in their ears. What they wanted to see was not the debris of an old Anatolian settlement, but a stage upon which myth had walked. Excavations have shown that during the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, Troy, by then called Ilium, was refurbished with colonnaded streets, sanctuaries and theatres. These additions had little to do with its Bronze Age past and everything to do with its new role as a sacred memorial. Augustus himself endowed the site with patronage, treating it as if it were Rome's ancestral home. In this way, archaeology demonstrates how myth can influence stone, how poetry can lead to masonry, Tourism, too, became a part of the Roman-Trojan revival. Pilgrims from all over the empire came to Ilium to stand where they believed heroes once fought. Inscriptions suggest that local guides pointed out supposed tombs of Achilles, Ajax, and Hector. Visitors left offerings, coins, and prayers, turning the site into a kind of museum of legend. The city thrived economically because of this reputation, long after its political power had faded. Just as modern tourists flock to battlefields for a sense of connection, Romans travelled to Ilium to bridge the gap between their daily lives and the mythic past. In this sense, the Roman Troy was not a place of strategy or commerce, but of memory and identity. What is striking is the double function Troy served for Rome. On the one hand, it was a legitimizing myth for the highest levels of power. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and their successors used the Trojan connection to assert divine destiny and continuity. Coins minted under Augustus even displayed Trojan symbols, making the link explicit in everyday currency. On the other hand, Troy also became accessible to ordinary Romans who wished to partake in that heritage. For them, the site was a tangible reminder that they belonged to a civilization with roots deeper than any rival. This blending of politics and pilgrimage reveals the adaptability of Troy's story. To the Greeks, it had been a cautionary tale about pride, rage, and divine will. To the Romans, it became a tale of survival, endurance, and chosen destiny. Both versions drew from the same mythic well, but each culture drank different lessons. And in this reimagining, the figure of Aeneas took on a new role. Where Achilles symbolized glory and Hector symbolized duty, Aeneas symbolized continuity. He did not fight to the death at Troy, he carried its legacy forward. For an empire that sought to project stability across centuries, Aeneas was the perfect ancestor. There are ironies here worth noting. The Romans, who would eventually conquer Greece and rule Anatolia, cast themselves as heirs of the Trojans, the very people the Greeks had supposedly destroyed. In claiming Trojan ancestry, Rome inverted the story, turning the victims of Homer's epic into the victors of history. The conquerors of the Mediterranean chose to remember themselves not as destroyers, but as survivors, heirs to a city that endured in spirit even if it fell in fact. It was a bold act of narrative appropriation, and it worked so well that for centuries after, educated Romans saw no contradiction, and so the city of Troy, abandoned and ruined, lived on in Roman imagination as a kind of ancestral ghost. Its power lay not in its walls, but in the stories told about it. We cannot say whether the citizens of Ilium in the Roman era felt like Trojans themselves or merely caretakers of a myth. What we can say is that without Rome's embrace, Troy might have been forgotten. Instead, by folding the story into their own, the Romans ensured its survival, passing it onward like a torch into the future. The haunting question remains: did the Romans truly believe in their Trojan origins, or did they simply find it too useful a story to abandon? Perhaps, as often in history, sincerity and politics were indistinguishable. What mattered was not whether Aeneas had walked ashore in Italy, but that Romans acted as though he had, and by doing so, they kept the embers of Troy glowing long after its walls had turned to dust. Was Troy a tourist trap in antiquity, or was it something closer to a shrine where myth and memory overlapped? To answer that, we need to picture the city not in flames, not as a battlefield, but as a destination in the centuries when Rome ruled the Mediterranean. By the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the site of Troy, by then widely referred to as Ilium, was no longer a contested stronghold, but a place of pilgrimage, curiosity, and ritual. Travellers came not to conquer it, but to touch it, to stand in the dust of walls they believed had once echoed with the voices of gods and heroes. The rise of Ilium as a pilgrimage centre was tied to the cultural weight of Homer's epics. By this point, the Iliad and the Odyssey were not just Greek poems, they were cultural currency across the Mediterranean world. Educated Romans and Greeks alike knew the verses by heart, and for many, a visit to the supposed stage of those events was as essential as visiting a theatre or a temple in their own hometown. Archaeological traces of this period show refurbishments designed to impress. Colonnaded avenues, sanctuaries, even a theatre built into the citadel mound. This was not accidental. The people of Ilium understood that their city's importance now lay not in trade routes or fortifications, but in its reputation as the memory of Troy. One of the most unusual traditions tied to this reputation was the ritual of the Locrian maidens. According to later accounts, the Greek city of Locroy sent 2 young women each year to serve at the sanctuary of Athena in Ilium. The custom was said to atone for an ancient sacrilege, when the Greek hero Ajax had dragged Cassandra, daughter of Priam, from Athena's temple during the sack of the city. To restore balance, generations of Locrians continued to send their daughters as symbolic compensation. The practice is said to have lasted for centuries with grim overtones. If a maiden was caught outside the sanctuary, she could be killed by locals as part of the ritual's severity. Whether the ritual truly survived into Roman times or whether later writers exaggerated it, the story itself reveals how Ilium's sanctuaries were not just tourist attractions, but places heavy with remembered offences and obligations. The Temple of Athena itself stood as the centrepiece of these pilgrimages. Athena was believed to have favoured the Greeks in Homer's telling, yet her cult in Ilium became the anchor of Trojan remembrance. Roman emperors visited the temple, sometimes offering gifts. Alexander the Great, centuries earlier, had already set the tone when he made sacrifice to Athena before his campaign into Asia, treating the goddess not just as a deity of war, but as a guardian of Troy's sacred memory. Under Roman patronage, the temple continued to draw worshippers. Pilgrims may have believed that by walking into its precincts they were stepping into the same ground where gods had intervened during the war itself. Beyond temples and rituals, Ilium offered the kind of storytelling that modern tourists might recognise. Local guides pointed out stones said to be part of the Scaean Gate, tombs identified as belonging to Achilles or Hector, and even sacred springs referenced by Homer. These identifications often stretch belief, but they serve the purpose of making myth tangible. Travellers could bring home not just memories, but proof of having stood where epic heroes had once stood. Inscriptions and coins from the period suggest that people left offerings, scratched graffiti, and purchased souvenirs, all part of the fabric of ancient pilgrimage. We might be tempted to think of this as ancient tourism in the modern commercial sense, but the evidence suggests it was also deeply religious. Ilium was treated not as a mere curiosity, but as a holy site. To walk its stones was to move through sacred time. Rituals like the Locrian maidens, sacrifices at Athena's temple, and offerings at supposed tombs show how myth functioned as lived religion. For many, this pilgrimage was less about seeing ruins than about bridging the gap between human history and divine intervention. At the same time, Ilium was undeniably shaped by empire. Roman investment ensured that the site remained visible, adorned with architecture that reflected Rome's own grandeur. By turning Troy into a monument, the Romans enshrined their claim to Trojan ancestry, while giving citizens a stage upon which to act out their connections to the myth. This is why Ilium flourished during these centuries, even as other ancient sites languished. It was both politically useful and spiritually magnetic. And yet, beneath the marble facades and ritual practices lies a haunting question. Did the people who came to Ilium in the first centuries of our era believe they were walking through the real Troy, or did they accept that they were inhabiting a carefully maintained memory? Archaeology cannot answer belief, but it shows us how thoroughly the site was reshaped to meet the needs of visitors. The hill that once held Bronze Age battlements now held temples, theatres and shrines. What survived was not the city that burned, but the idea of it, remade again and again to fit the desires of those who sought it. One dimension often overlooked in the story of pilgrimage to Ilium is how layered the visitors themselves were. Not all who came were emperors, poets, or wealthy elites on a grand tour. Archaeological traces, like small coins scattered across the sanctuary of Athena, and simple terracotta figurines, suggest that sailors, traders, and even soldiers stationed in the eastern provinces also found their way to the ruins. For these travellers, the experience may not have been grand or poetic, but humble, placing a coin at a shrine before embarking across the unpredictable waters of the Aegean, or leaving a figurine as a token of protection for a family far away. In that sense, Ilium functioned less like a museum and more like a living crossroads, where the myth of Troy became accessible to people at every social level. We also need to imagine the sensory experience of such a visit. Pilgrims would have walked up the hill of Hisarlik, past cultivated fields and scattered villages, until the landscape shifted into monumental stonework, arches, gates, and sanctuaries maintained under Roman patronage. The air would have carried the smell of incense from sacrifices, mingling with the dust of the windswept plain. Guides reciting lines of Homer might have competed with the sounds of prayers offered in different dialects, while the clang of coins in temple treasuries reminded visitors that devotion had an economic dimension. For many, the power of Troy lay not in any single building, but in the combination of atmosphere, story, and ritual. The city became a performance space where the past was continually reenacted in the present. Another fascinating element of this period is how Ilium served as a backdrop for negotiation between myth and politics. Local elites in the city benefited from the Roman embrace of Trojan ancestry, presenting themselves as custodians of a heritage that Rome valued. Inscriptions show local magistrates dedicating altars to Roman emperors, alongside dedications to Athena, blurring civic loyalty with sacred duty. For these leaders, maintaining the cult practices and architectural splendour of Ilium was not just about honouring tradition, but also about securing political favour from Rome. Pilgrimage, in other words, kept Ilium alive both spiritually and economically. We cannot ignore that this layering of meanings made the site vulnerable to reinterpretation. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, when Christianity was spreading across the empire, some Christian authors already treated Troy with ambivalence. To them, it was a reminder of pagan excess, of gods interfering in human wars. But even in that shifting religious landscape, the allure of Ilium as a place to see and touch Homer's world endured. It was harder to erase a story that had become physically enshrined in stone and ritually reinforced by centuries of visitors. This dual character, part shrine, part spectacle, is perhaps why Troy's fame survived so long. Unlike other Bronze Age cities that were forgotten once their political relevance waned, Ilium reinvented itself as a stage for memory. It was never the same Troy twice, but it was always Troy enough for those who needed it. And in that adaptability lies a paradox that still challenges us. Was the Troy of the Roman pilgrims any less real than the Troy of Homer, or the Troy of Schliemann's trenches? Or is the persistence of pilgrimage itself the truest evidence that the city was never entirely lost? Why did Troy finally vanish? For centuries after Homer's words were first sung, after Alexander had laid his wreath, after Augustus had raised colonnades, the hill of Hisarlik continued to be visited, repaired, and reimagined. And yet by the late 4th through the 7th centuries of the Common Era, the city that had survived fire and war succumbed not to a single dramatic event, but to a slow erosion of relevance. What toppled Troy was not the clash of bronze, but the weight of mud, the trembling of earth, and the changing tides of faith. The first of these forces was the sea itself, or rather, its retreat. The Dardanelles had once been the artery that gave Troy life, connecting it to the Black Sea and the broader Aegean trading world. But rivers do not stop for memory, and over centuries the Scamander and Simoeis carried silt down to the plain. By the 4th century the once busy harbour was clogging, shrinking into marshland. The lagoon that had once sheltered ships grew shallow, making large-scale maritime trade increasingly difficult. Pilgrims could still come by land, but the sense of Troy as a port, its strategic justification, was disappearing grain by grain. In this, geology achieved what armies never could. It cut Troy off from the sea that had defined it. Earthquakes added to the decline. Archaeological layers from this period show collapsed masonry, fallen columns, and hasty repairs. Ancient builders had once designed walls to resist tremors, but centuries of shifting ground weakened even the strongest foundations. Repeated quakes made Ilium less a place of awe and more a place of ruin. What had been temples gleaming with marble now stood cracked, their statues toppled, their roofs open to the sky. And while earlier generations might have rebuilt with determination, by late antiquity the will to restore had waned. The most decisive change, however, was not geological but cultural. With the rise of Christianity, Troy's pagan associations became liabilities. The Temple of Athena, once the heart of pilgrimage, had no place in a Christian empire that sought to redirect devotion to new centres: Jerusalem, Constantinople, Rome. Imperial patronage that had once flowed into Ilium's sanctuaries dried up, diverted to basilicas and shrines of saints. Even if locals wished to maintain Troy's cults, the larger political and financial support was gone. By the 5th century, the city no longer had emperors making offerings at its altars. Instead, bishops and councils condemned such practices as remnants of idolatry. For a brief time, Troy may have lingered as a curiosity, a ruin still spoken of in classrooms where Homer was taught, or whispered about by travellers. But without patronage, trade, or faith, the city drifted into obscurity. By the 7th century, with plague and further earthquakes striking Anatolia, Ilium was reduced to a shadow of itself. Stones were scavenged for building in nearby villages. What once drew kings and emperors now stood as scattered walls and broken foundations. The site was not destroyed, it simply faded, abandoned to silence and goats grazing across terraces where heroes had once been remembered. And so Troy's final disappearance was not a blaze like the one Homer described, but a long surrender to nature and time. It raises a haunting question. Is it better for a city to burn in a single unforgettable night, or to slip away so gradually that no one quite notices when it is gone? In the case of Troy, the answer may be both. It burned in story, but in history, it drowned in mud and silence. Another element in Troy's quiet vanishing was the simple exhaustion of cultural memory. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, schoolchildren in the eastern Mediterranean still studied Homer, but they read him as literature, not as geography. Troy was no longer a living shrine, but a classroom reference, reduced to verses copied onto wax tablets and papyrus rolls. Even among the educated, the Iliad's Troy had become less a physical place, and more a moral lesson about pride, loss, and divine justice. Without constant visits, sacrifices, or imperial rituals to anchor the story in stone, the city lost the magnetic pull that had once drawn thousands across the Aegean. In this way, Troy slipped from the realm of pilgrimage into the realm of poetry alone. Economic shifts added to this fading. The trade networks that had once fed Ilium's prosperity were collapsing under the weight of broader crises in the late Roman world. Grain shipments that once passed through the Dardanelles were rerouted, taxed, or disrupted by raids. The Western Empire crumbled, and the Eastern Empire concentrated resources on defending Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. A provincial town with fading temples no longer mattered in the grand calculus of empire. As resources dwindled, Ilium became less able to maintain its infrastructure. The grand colonnaded streets crumbled without repair, and the once proud theatre filled with rubble and weeds. We also have to consider disease. The 6th century was marked by the Justinianic plague, a pandemic that ravaged the Eastern Empire and may have swept across the Troad as well. Written accounts describe entire villages emptied, economies shattered, and fields untended. For a city already weakened by earthquakes, silting, and religious disfavour, epidemic illness may have been the final blow. Pilgrims who once sought Troy for memory and devotion might have avoided it out of fear, leaving its sanctuaries deserted and its markets silent. What followed was the long transformation of Troy from a place of meaning into a quarry for stone. Medieval builders in the region pried marble blocks and carved stones from Ilium's ruins to construct churches, houses, and fortifications elsewhere. What had once been the Temple of Athena or the Theatre of Augustus now became door lintels, paving slabs, and cornerstones for new villages. Troy's grandeur did not vanish so much as dissolve into the walls of later generations, scattered and hidden across the landscape. By the 7th century, travellers who might have once expected to find a bustling shrine would instead have found a ghost town, with wind whistling through crumbling arches and vegetation overtaking the citadel mound. In the end, Troy's disappearance was less a tragedy than a kind of erasure by indifference. The city that had once stood at the centre of epic empire and pilgrimage became just another ruin, forgotten not because it had burned too brightly, but because it had ceased to matter. And yet, paradoxically, this very forgetting may have ensured its later rediscovery. A city abandoned in silence was also a city waiting in the soil, untouched until the world once again cared to look. Why did medieval kings think they descended from Trojans? To understand this, we have to leave the archaeological trenches behind and step into the realm of chronicles, manuscripts, and royal propaganda. Between the 12th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, Troy became less a city of ruins in Asia Minor, and more a genealogical seedbed for dynasties across Europe. The city that Homer had described was recast as the fountainhead of medieval identity, a mythic ancestor that could legitimize kingdoms and unite peoples under a shared heroic past. One of the most influential versions of this reinvention came from Geoffrey of Monmouth, a 12th century cleric who wrote the Historia Regum Britannia, or History of the Kings of Britain. In Geoffrey's account, the legendary founder of Britain was Brutus, a descendant of the Trojan hero Aeneas. Exiled and fated to wander, Brutus supposedly sailed west, landed on the island that would take his name, and established a line of kings that ultimately culminated in Arthur. This genealogy was not taken as fantasy by Geoffrey's readers, but as credible history, taught and copied in monastic scriptoria. To claim Trojan ancestry was to claim connection to the greatest story in the Western imagination, a story that placed Britain not at the margins but at the heart of sacred time. Geoffrey was not alone. French and Italian chroniclers likewise traced their origins back to Troy. The Roman de Troyes, a massive 12th century poem by Benoit de Saint-Maur, retold the entire Trojan War in a medieval idiom, casting Achilles and Hector as knights in armour, reciting speeches like those of chivalric courts. The point was not accuracy but familiarity. The Trojan War became a template for medieval warfare and morality. The French monarchy, in particular, embraced the idea that their nobility carried Trojan blood, weaving it into their claims of destiny and supremacy. This mythic ancestry was not limited to the aristocracy. Cities too claimed Trojan founders. Florence, Paris, and Venice were all linked in one text or another to refugees fleeing the burning of Troy. Chroniclers wrote these myths with great seriousness, inserting Trojan founders into civic charters and municipal histories. For populations living through the instability of medieval Europe, wars, famines, plagues, the notion of descending from a noble and tragic civilization gave a sense of order and continuity. The Trojan myth was also a canvas for moral reflection. Medieval writers drew lessons from Troy about the dangers of hubris, the unpredictability of fate, and the destructiveness of desire. In this way, Troy was not just an origin myth, but a sermon disguised as history. For kings, however, the genealogical angle mattered most. By claiming descent from Priam or Aeneas, monarchs could suggest that their right to rule was not simply feudal accident, but divine continuity. To be a king was to carry the torch of Troy across centuries, a torch that no fire or ruin could extinguish. The irony is striking. At the very moment when the physical site of Troy lay buried and forgotten under a Turkish mound, the idea of Troy reached its widest medieval audience. The Troy known to Geoffrey of Monmouth and Benoit de Saint-Maur was not a city of mud brick walls and earthquake cracks, but a courtly stage filled with knights and queens. It was Troy rewritten for an age of castles and crusades. And yet this medieval Troy raises its own haunting question. When a city becomes a story so adaptable that every nation can claim it, does it still belong to history, or has it crossed into pure imagination? We may never know how many listeners in those candlelit halls truly believed that their kings carried Trojan blood, but we know they acted as if it were true. In medieval Europe, that belief alone was powerful enough to shape identities, politics, and even wars. What deepened Troy's medieval hold on the imagination was the way it became a universal storybook, constantly reshaped to mirror the anxieties and ideals of each region. In monasteries, clerics translated the ancient narratives into Latin chronicles that threaded the Trojans into biblical history, situating Priam and his sons alongside figures like Noah and Abraham in a long, sacred timeline. This made Troy not simply a pagan past, but a precursor, a city that could be woven into the Christian narrative of humanity. By drawing these connections, chroniclers allowed the myth to function as more than nostalgia. It became a bridge between antiquity and Salvation history. Court poets went even further, recasting Troy in the language of romance. Works such as Guido delle Colonne's Historia Destructionis Troiae in the late 13th century painted Hector, Paris and Helen as courtly lovers and chivalric warriors. These retellings were less about war strategy, and more about the codes of honour, loyalty and betrayal that resonated in the feudal courts of Europe. For a knight listening to such tales, Troy felt like a mirror of his own world, only magnified into legend. This is how Achilles could become a restless baron, and Helen a lady of courtly love. The epic was reshaped until it looked like a medieval mirror. Political uses of Troy spread far beyond France and Britain. In the German lands, chroniclers traced lineages of local rulers to Trojans who had supposedly migrated up the Danube. In Scandinavia, sagas occasionally linked noble families to Trojan survivors, folding the myth into Norse storytelling. The reach of Troy across medieval Europe shows how adaptable the myth was. Each community could graft itself onto the ruins of Ilium without worrying about archaeological evidence or historical chronology. Troy was no longer bound to geography. It had become a portable origin. But this portability came with a curious side effect. As more kings and nations claimed Trojan descent, the exclusivity of the claim eroded. If the French were Trojans, and the British were Trojans, and the Venetians were Trojans, then who really carried the legacy of Priam's house? The myth multiplied rather than clarified. Yet perhaps this was precisely the point. Troy was less about literal ancestry than about shared belonging to a grand tragic story. In an age where bloodlines were central to authority, saying you were Trojan meant saying your destiny was already inscribed in the world's oldest poetry. What remains most striking is how far Troy travelled without its ruins. No pilgrim paths wound to Hisarlik in these centuries. No kings laid wreaths on Achilles' tomb. Instead, the memory of Troy thrived in ink and parchment, in castles and cloisters, in the minds of people who never saw Anatolia. It is a reminder that sometimes a city survives more powerfully as an idea than as a set of stones. And it leaves us wondering, when the physical Troy lay forgotten under farmland, was the medieval Troy, imagined, written, believed, any less real to those who carried its name in their lineage? Why was Europe obsessed with Troy again? The ruins had been quiet for centuries, buried beneath a mound of earth in northwestern Anatolia, but the idea of Troy never disappeared. In the early modern period, between the 17th and 19th centuries, the Trojan story was not simply retold, it was reimagined, revived, and made into a cultural touchstone once more. This renewed fascination did not come from archaeology, that would come later, but from the way humanists, playwrights, and educators turned Troy into a prism for their own societies, their ambitions and their doubts. The Renaissance had already brought a flood of classical texts back into circulation in Europe, and with them came Homer and Virgil. For scholars in Florence, Venice, Paris, and London, Troy was not just a distant war but a fountainhead of Western identity. Virgil's Aeneid became a required text, cementing Rome's Trojan ancestry and the education of Europe's elites. And because Rome was taken as the model of political and cultural greatness, Troy stood silently behind it, the shadowed ancestor of all ancestors. Schoolboys in England or France might never hear of the real Hisarlik, but they grew up translating the speeches of Aeneas into Latin or Greek, reciting lines that cast Troy as the root of European civilization. In that sense, Troy's survival was not in stone but in the dusty classrooms of grammar schools. Playwrights took the myth in yet another direction. William Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, written around the year 1602, turned the epic into a dark and bitter satire. Instead of gods and heroes, Shakespeare presented disillusioned warriors, cynical politics, and a love story that ends not in triumph, but betrayal. His Troy was not a city of destiny, but a mirror of Elizabethan anxieties, about war, corruption, and the fragility of honour. For audiences, this was a different kind of Ilium, not sacred, not glorious, but human and fallible. The Renaissance obsession with Troy was not just admiration, it was also interrogation. By the Enlightenment, the Trojan War had become both an object of scepticism and fascination. Rationalist scholars in France and Germany questioned whether the war had ever happened at all. Some argued that Homer's epics were pure fiction, allegories dressed up as history. Others maintained that the story must have had a kernel of truth, even if exaggerated. In this period, Troy became a case study in the problem of myth and history. How much of the past can we trust when it comes down to poetry? The debate fed into larger Enlightenment questions about human progress, the reliability of tradition, and the role of reason in cutting through legend. At the same time, Troy thrived in art and opera. Painters depicted scenes of the Trojan Horse or the grief of Andromache, often draped in costumes that looked suspiciously 18th century rather than Bronze Age. Composers like Gluck and Berlioz turned the war into music, filling theatres with voices that carried the names of Achilles, Hector and Helen back into the public ear. Here Troy was spectacle, an ancient tragedy reshaped for salons and stages, where myth became entertainment but also moral instruction. By the 19th century, the classical education system had made Troy inescapable. Elite schools across Europe drilled their students in Homer line by line in Greek and Latin. Politicians, poets and scholars all grew up with the Iliad as a second language. The result was a generation of leaders and intellectuals for whom Troy felt not just legendary but personal. To quote Homer was to display learning, refinement and a kind of membership in an imagined pan-European classical tradition. Troy was as much a credential as a story. This context explains why, when Heinrich Schliemann arrived at Hisarlik in the 1870s with a spade and a dream, the world paid attention. His announcement that he had found Troy struck like thunder, because it confirmed, at least in part, what schoolmasters and poets had kept alive for centuries. It is no accident that his discoveries made front-page news and were celebrated not just as archaeological triumphs, but as cultural vindication. The obsession with Troy had primed Europe for this moment. For generations the city had lived in the imagination, and suddenly here was a man claiming to put his hand on its stones. But behind that enthusiasm lay an unresolved tension. Was Troy to be admired as history, as literature, or as both? The early modern obsession had made it all three, a symbol of civilization, a cautionary tale, and a mystery to be solved. By the year 1890, Troy had returned to the centre of European discourse, no longer just an echo in poetry, but a place people believed they could touch. Whether it was Shakespeare's cynical warriors, Enlightenment skeptics with their quills, or Schliemann with his trench, each age had found in Troy what it most needed: a mirror, a stage, a puzzle. And it leaves us with the question, were they chasing Troy itself, or simply chasing the image they had built of it in their own minds? The 19th century carried Troy into a new phase of cultural life, one that blended nostalgia, scholarship and ambition. By then, the city was no longer just a tale to be performed in theatres or dissected in salons. It became a battleground of national pride and intellectual rivalry. European powers competing for influence in the Eastern Mediterranean often invoked Troy as part of their cultural inheritance. For the British, the Trojan story was folded into imperial rhetoric, a way of suggesting continuity between ancient conquerors and their own expanding empire. For the Germans, steeped in classical philology and newly unified under Prussian leadership, Troy became a symbol of both cultural mastery and scientific rigour. Each nation claimed to read Homer more faithfully, to understand antiquity more deeply, and ultimately to stand as heir to the civilization Troy had supposedly fathered. The Romantic movement added yet another layer. Poets like Byron and Keats did not simply admire Homer, they infused Troy with longing, melancholy, and the awareness of ruin. For Byron, who actually travelled through the region, the ruins of antiquity embodied both grandeur and fragility. A civilization that once towered over the Aegean now reduced to fragments in the soil. This sense of loss resonated with the Romantic preoccupation with mortality and the sublime. Troy was no longer only a stage for gods and warriors. It became a meditation on time itself, on how memory can preserve what the earth erases. Meanwhile, the academic study of antiquity hardened into disciplines. Philologists compared Homeric verses across manuscripts, historians weighed myth against Near Eastern sources, and geographers argued over maps of Anatolia. The question of where Troy had actually stood became a matter of professional debate. Scholars such as Charles MacLaren and Frank Calvert made careful cases for Hisarlik before Schliemann arrived, showing that Troy was not merely a poetic name, but could be anchored to a real landscape. The groundwork of critical scholarship ensured that when the mound was finally excavated, it was already charged with expectation. Troy had become more than a curiosity. It was a test case for the new sciences of history and archaeology. It is telling that the rediscovery of Troy coincided with an age when the past was being systematically dug up across the world. Pompeii, Nineveh and Mycenae all came to light in the same century, feeding a hunger to prove myths with spades. In that climate, Troy was irresistible because it was not just any ruin. It was the ruin. To confirm its reality meant to bridge literature and archaeology, to unite the Homer of schoolrooms with the soil of Anatolia. That is why Schliemann's claims stirred so much excitement, even when his methods were deeply flawed. By the end of the 19th century, Troy was embedded in Europe's imagination in a way that was both old and new. Old, because the story had never faded since antiquity. New, because it had now become entangled with the authority of science, nationalism, and global rivalry. In some sense, Troy had been discovered long before Schliemann cut into Hisarlik. It had been discovered in every classroom, every stage, every debate that kept the city alive for centuries. The mound waited, but Europe had already built its Troy in the mind. Why does a story about a city that may or may not have existed still echo across the modern world? Why, after more than 3,000 years, do we continue to wrestle with the same questions that puzzled Homer's first audiences? Perhaps the answer lies not in what Troy was, but in what it represents. A place where memory, imagination, and archaeology intersect. For some, Troy is a site of national pride. For others, a timeless metaphor for war, love, and loss. And for many more, it remains a question mark that refuses to go away. In the modern era, Troy has moved far beyond the pages of Homer. It has become a cultural touchstone, reshaped by novels, operas, paintings, and cinema. Hollywood's adaptation in the early 21st century brought Achilles' nectar back to life on the silver screen, flattening nuance but reigniting fascination. The film was criticised for historical liberties, but its global audience showed that the Trojan War still speaks to something universal. When actors stride across sand in bronze armour, we are not watching history, we are watching our need for history. Troy becomes the canvas onto which each generation paints its anxieties about violence, loyalty, and desire. Meanwhile, archaeologists continue to return to Hisarlik with new tools. Where Schliemann used picks and dynamite, modern teams use ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, and digital modelling. These methods do not promise the romance of a treasure chest, but offer something subtler: context. Layers of soil reveal trade routes, diets, and building techniques. Isotopes in teeth tell us where individuals grew up, whether they were locals or migrants. Microscopic charcoal fragments suggest fires that might have been accidental or deliberate. The story of Troy today is built less on sweeping claims and more on careful accumulation of evidence. It is slower, humbler work, but perhaps closer to truth. Yet the questions remain unresolved. Was there a war in the late Bronze Age that inspired Homer? Were the Trojans Luwians, Thracians, or something else entirely? Was the wooden horse a real contraption, or a poetic metaphor? Each answer spawns more questions, and perhaps that is why Troy endures. If archaeology gave us certainty, the city might lose its hold on our imagination. Instead, the gaps allow us to keep telling and retelling, reshaping the story to fit new contexts. The uncertainty is not a flaw, it is the very reason Troy survives. And beyond archaeology and literature, Troy continues to function as a mirror. When empires rose, they saw themselves in its ruins. When poets sought tragedy, they turned to its characters. Today, in an age of rapid change and disillusionment, Troy reflects our search for meaning in the past. We may never know exactly what happened on that hilltop in Anatolia 3,000 years ago, but perhaps that is the point. Troy reminds us that humans are not only creatures of evidence, but of narrative. We need stories to give shape to memory, to explain conflict, to mourn loss. So why does Troy still matter? Because it asks us to hold two truths at once: that history is fragile and incomplete, and that myth can preserve something history cannot. It asks us to keep looking, knowing we will never fully find. And maybe that is what makes Troy eternal, not the certainty of its stones, but the persistence of our questions. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.